welcome to this event entitled South Africa's 2024 Election, a brief guide on the new voting system and the vision for the future. My name is Luanda Mbose, and I'm going to be facilitating two of the sessions today. Just a brief overview of what we are doing here today. We are launching a special report, which is entitled Commissions, Corruption and State Capture, Charting a New Way Forward for South Africa. And we're using this opportunity as well to kind of have a very frank and robust discussion about South Africa's new voting system, trying to link that to foreign policy and understand how this works in different countries around the world. We will really go deeply into how this new system works. We know that independent candidates now are able to run for elections in South Africa, but the nitty-gritties of that have been very unclear for most people. So these are the conversations that we're going to be having today. So we're going to be starting very briefly with the presentation about the new voting system. And here we will have two speakers, and then we will have another session after a comfort break that looks at a comparison of party manifestos to start foreign policy objectives. And I do think that's going to be very important because it gives us an understanding of the different manifestos in South Africa, and it then provides that linkage with foreign policy. And then we will have a third session that then looks very closely at the special reports that I have just spoken to. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'm going to invite Professor Daryl Glaser from the Wits University to kick us off with the presentation about the voting system that has been updated in South Africa. Prof, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I have in recent years become something of an electoral system nerd. So that might be something to do with why I'm here. I was also on the Ministerial Advisory Committee set in 2021 to advise the executive on the voting system option. So I gather I have to talk about why we have this new voting system and to tell you something about it. The mechanics of the new voting system are quite intertwined with the story of how we came to have it. You'll see that my title page puts the word new in inverted commas. And why is that? Right. It may seem that we've had a change of the electoral system, independence, 3 ballots, but actually it's the same system. Basically, we have a tweaked version of the closed list proportional representation system that we've always had, but now independents have been inserted into the system and are able to compete with political parties. Pretty much a unique arrangement. It's one that, strictly speaking, doesn't make sense to have independents competing with party lists in that way. And the only country I've been able to find so far that has anything comparable was Romania. Or at least Romania had something like that as of 2014. I haven't been updated on the Romanian electoral system. However, obviously the big story is that independents are allowed to stand, independent candidates. It's no longer party lists only. However, they can only compete with parties for half of the 400 seats in the National Assembly. All of the seats in the provincial legislatures, but for only half the seats in the National Assembly. That is to say, the 200 regional seats, 200 of the seats in the National Assembly are called regional seats, as opposed to the 200 national compensatory seats. And it's for the 200 regional seats that the independents can compete along with parties. Hence, we have a 200-200 split that requires a separate ballot, each 200 as it were. So, apart from the first ballot, which is the provincial legislative ballot, you always cast. There's a second ballot, which is for the what's called the regional representatives of the National Assembly, and the third ballot, which is for the national compensatory list. Now, this might strike some people as an entirely novel arrangement. In fact, the 200-200 split's not itself new. It's simply been made explicit. We've actually had it every election since 2024. We just don't know it. Basically, what we've had in the outgoing system was that you cast a single vote, but the vote was first counted in your region. So if you cast your vote in Gauteng, it will first be counted in Gauteng to see how many Gauteng representatives you are entitled to have in the National Assembly, and to work out who would fill those Gauteng National Assembly seats. And then the same vote would be taken and thrown into a big national pot and treated as the equivalent of a second vote to get the picture across the nation, which would then be used to correct any disproportionality that had arisen from the first ballot. So we've already had these 9 kind of sort of fake constituencies. But the relationship between the 2 ballots was all work done behind the scenes by the IEC, so none of us ever knew about it. But now, because the independents are only standing for one half of that, but not the other half, now we need separate ballots for each half of the system. So effectively, a pre-existing system, the 200-200 split that's always been there, has been made explicit. So we've always had a sort of constituency system, just these very large multi-member constituencies that are the equivalent in size of provinces and in shape to provinces. Now, I did hint earlier at the fact that I thought this tweaked list proportional representation system, strictly speaking, doesn't make sense. The system is problematic in various ways, but especially in its potential consequences, firstly for proportionality. The basic problem is this: independents can only fill 1 seat in 1 region, no matter how many votes they win. I mean, after all, they are just independent trying to fill 1 seat. So, but they could win the vote equivalent of 10 seats, but they only get 1 seat, which is fine for them. They still get their place in Parliament. That's a bit hard on their supporters, whose substantial share of the national vote is then funneled into a single seat. There's also the complexity, which is exactly this whole thing that's confusing everybody, the 3 ballots. Voters now face 3 ballots, 2 for the National Assembly and 1 for the provincial legislature, which many will find confusing. At least theoretically, there was a potential problem of overlong regional ballots. If like countless independents decided to stand, they didn't. And there was also the potential problem, which hasn't materialized, but could still in future, of a proliferation of consequent information overload and more wasted votes. But the whole question of information overload is important. I mean, one of the many functions parties perform in a political system is to provide information cues. That is to say, whatever voting system you've got, whether it's first past the post or a list system, simply knowing that someone stands for a particular party, especially if it's a reasonably well-known party, gives the ordinary voter a clue as to who that vote is, what they stand for, and roughly speaking, how they're likely to behave once elected. It's very difficult to get that information if you've got a proliferation of independents, because no one's going to read like 10s or 20s of independent manifestos. So how did we get here? Now, it's important to note that the earlier electoral reform debate was not in fact about independence. The outgoing system, it should be said, in fairness, was excellent in delivering fairness, diversity of parties, gender representativity, and minimization of voting wastage. So I'm not one of those who introduces the old system. But it failed to deliver 2 things that electoral reformers believed were necessary. One was direct individual election of individual candidates, and the second is a local link, local representation to members of parliament. Now, although there hasn't been a widespread clamour for electoral reform, there has been a crisis of representation manifesting rapidly declining and alarmingly low electoral turnout, not to mention vast amounts of protests, extra parliamentary protests. These can be taken as indications that the institutional representation system is not working well, as does the proliferation of numerous forms of informal intermediation between individuals and the state in the form of community organizations and so on. Now, a lot of the electoral reform is called for for constituencies. They typically have in mind either single member constituencies or small multi-member constituencies. It should be said it's not that clear that direct and or local representation would solve this crisis of representation. See the experience of local government where half the seats, the ward seats, are basically elected through first past the post. Basically single member plurality as it's known technically. But as we know, local government's not particularly popular or considered to be particularly accountable or successful. But it's realistic to hope that a local link could bring some improvements. I mean, I know that, for example, knowing my local ward councillor and being able to contact her is reassuring in certain situations. So it's certainly are prospects of some benefits from such a local link. How did the electoral debate come to centre, however, around the issue of independence? Independents were not part of the electoral reform debate at all, at least not until very recently. The famous Slavitt report, or the electoral task team of 2003, much invoked by reformers, never mentioned independence. It did not even initially offer an opportunity to vote for individuals. You know, those 9 regions that I say we've always had, it wanted to increase the number to 69. But they would all be multi-member constituencies, initially with closed party lists. The Slavitt envisaged that at some point they could become open party lists, where voters for a party could have some control over the order in which candidates appear on party lists. The focus on independence was the result of the initiative of the New Nation movement and various others, who demanded that individuals should have a right to stand for the National Assembly and provincial legislature as individuals separately from parties. It's not entirely clear to me why they were preoccupied with this. It appears they were a group of civic in the New Nation movement who had some dealings with in previous years. They were a group of civic-minded people who believed that the parties were basically the root of all evil, which in fact they're not. But this is the conviction they formed, and this is why they thought that getting independence, people outside of parties to stand, was a central matter for electoral reform. They took this matter to the courts in 2019 and 2020, and the Constitutional Court agreed with them in a 2020 judgment. Basically, the Constitutional Court wasn't looking at the strengths and weaknesses of different electoral systems. What it was doing was looking at the Constitution's understanding of our political rights. And it decided that we have that our political rights are individual political rights, and that we have a right to disassociate ourselves from political parties. I won't go into the details of the judgment. So the Constitutional Court then required that changes be made to accommodate independent candidates. Now, in terms of options for incorporating independence into a proportional system, so a ministerial advisory committee was set up to consider options. And I was a member of that ministerial advisory committee, set up to advise the executive. Now, I'd love to be able to give a lengthy tutorial on electoral systems. I can't, but take my word for it that only 2 proportional systems can accommodate independence in a natural way, by which I mean a logically coherent way. One is what's called the single transferable vote system, which you've got in in Ireland, in the lower house, and in Australia in the upper house, and where you don't vote for parties at all, you vote for individuals in ranked order. Some of the individuals are explicitly party members, some of them are independents. So independents will appear in exactly the same way that party members will on the ballot. The other is some form of mixed member proportional system, which is roughly what we've got in local government. Basically, you've got this combination of first past the post, single member plurality wards, and then compensatory top up through party lists. Of course, you could say, well, what about first past the post? That accommodates just on its own, accommodates independence naturally, but of course, the constitutional requirement is that the system had to be proportional. So a narrow majority of the MAC, of which I was part, as part of this narrow majority, we advocated a modified version of the South African local government mixed member proportional system with important modifications, which you can ask about later if you're interested in that level of mechanical detail. However, a minority faction led by Mike Sutcliffe did not want to entertain either mixed member proportional system or single transferable vote, the two systems that could logically accommodate independence. And he pushed for what we termed instead the minimalist option, which is what the government adopted and what we've got, which is basically taking the existing system and inserting independent candidates into it to basically have independents standing alongside and against parties. Basically, it was a rejection of any more radical change because, I mean, strictly speaking, constitutionally, all that the Constitutional Court required was that independents be accommodated in the system on some reasonably fair basis. It did not dictate the voting system, but some of us in the MAC thought, okay, there is this longer standing electoral reform debate where people want more local or direct representation. Let's use this opportunity that's probably not going to come very often to look at something more dramatic. But essentially, Mike Sutcliffe, who seemed to represent one faction in the tripartite alliance, was pushing this minimalist option, as opposed to, for example, Mohammed Vali Musa, the chair of the commission, who's also ANC proximate, but was pushing the mixed member proportional option. So there wasn't a unified ANC position. So why did the ANC adopt the minimalist option? It should be said, it's tempting to be entirely cynical about it, but the fact that we've got proportional representation in the first place was not something that was necessarily in the ANC's interest. It would actually have done better under a first past the post system. The ANC was quite concerned at that negotiating stage to have a more inclusive system, and that's why we got proportional representation. And it also has to be said that a more radical change, as long as proportional, would not have posed a threat to the seat share of existing parties. So ANC, EFF, and others did not reject a more radical change for fear of losing seat share. That wasn't a consideration. Some did have legitimate worries that a more radical change would be less good for gender representation. I could explain why that might have been the case if you want to follow that up. More self-interestedly, one could speculate, party leaders may have feared loss of control over candidate selection. Therefore, party bosses would have less control over members of parliament or members of the provincial legislature. But I suspect the biggest single reason that the government adopted the minority report, i.e. just inserting independence into the existing system, was convenience. A way of avoiding having to demarcate new constituencies or have a much more extended reform debate, for that matter, prior to the approaching 2024 election. But maybe I'm just being naive in viewing that as the principal consideration. Certainly others took a more cynical view and treated this as a kind of party monopoly protecting itself against newcomers. It's worth just saying, how am I doing time-wise?
You have about 4 minutes, Prof.
Okay. It's worth just saying that independent candidature in general is something that comes with pros and cons. I mean, one might hope that independent candidates will introduce new ideas. You get sort of dogged single issue independents who press certain issues that need to be pressed. They can potentially render the system more accessible to political and sociological outsiders, rendering the whole political system more democratically egalitarian. But do remember that South Africa's outgoing system already had very low entry barriers. Many small parties were in effect one-man bands anyway, pretty much as independent candidates would be. I mean, think of Aham under Rampele or Good under Patricia de Lille. There are potential cons of independent candidature, leaving aside the problems that specifically associated with inserting them into our existing system. I'm going to have to run through this list very fast. You can follow up if you want to. Risks of personalism, clientelism, focus on individual rather than policies, focus on local delivery rather than national programs, ethnic voting, because you don't know anything about, if you don't know anything about a candidate, the fact that they're of a particular ethnic group might steer you towards them. Information overload, which I've talked about. Some independents will be opportunists, accountable to often unknown donors, but no one else between elections, or actually be party insiders, standing tactically as independents, and so on. And a proliferation of independents could also affect the stability, the ability to form stable government coalitions and maintain them. But yeah, be that as it may, the whole independent thing looks in the end like a bit of a damn squib, which is rather remarkable given the amount of attention it got. Only 12 are standing, 6 for the National Assembly, 6 for the provincial legislatures. Only one, Zaki Ahmad, has widespread name recognition and a widely known track record. Some of the independents, I've done a little bit of biographical follow-up. Some of them are rather dubious or odd characters. Think of Louis Liebenberg standing in 3 regions for the National Assembly, a fraud-accused diamond magnate and Zuma patron. This Patella is wanting to bring us all to God. Thana Segreng Moodley is standing for the KZN provincial legislature, and he's a comedian doing so on a kind of Indian sectarian ticket. So it's a very odd group of people. Without party cues, voters will have little idea who most of these candidates are. Sorry. What their records look like and how they're likely to vote as members of parliament. On the plus side, this means that the feared negative consequences of having independence are unlikely to materialize, but neither is South Africa likely to see many of the positive consequences. So why do so few independents come forward? The 1,000 signature requirements may still be burdensome for individuals without resource backing. The regional quotas are still relatively high. There's the forfeiture of excess votes. I think this is important. Some of the demand for opportunities on the part of individuals to enter parliament is already met in part by the option of forming smaller parties. See, for example, Muzi Maimani's Build One South Africa, Themba Godi via the African People's Convention. After all, you've got a better chance of actually getting in with a small party. Your excess votes are not wasted, for example. And if you win enough votes, you can actually have more than one member of parliament. So there was a whole issue around whether all this was fair to independence. We can discuss that if you want to. I don't think it's a central question. So concluding reflections, has South Africa missed the chance to introduce a more radical version of proportional representation that meets long-standing demands for direct and local election? Probably for the time being, although there's meant to be under the Electoral Amendment Act, a committee set up to consider further changes for future elections. I'm actually not sure if it's been set up yet. We'll see what, if anything, comes from it. I'm not sure that electoral system change, even more radical, will address South Africa's fundamental problems of misgovernance. But certain electoral changes could help, albeit that we should not expect too much from them. Okay, that's me. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very comprehensive and very insightful presentation. Before I go to Kaya, Prof, I want to come back to you just for a quick reflection. 30 years into our democracy, does this new system signal maturity of our democracy, or does it signal something different? Just in a minute.
I wouldn't say it signals maturity. I think it's an attempt to absorb and perhaps to deflect a long-standing demand for changes. So when the outgoing system was set up, it was seen as a temporary system, as a transitional system designed to maximize inclusion. That's why the issue of accountability was put to one side. So there was always this possibility of changing to a more permanent system, and there was a demand for it. This could be seen as marking maturity in the sense that we're finally responding to the demand, but it could also be seen as a way of co-opting and absorbing that demand without doing anything really fundamentally different.
Thank you, Prof. And to our viewers online, we want to bring you into the discussion as much as possible. So I'm going to give Kanya the floor now, but please do leave your comments or raise your hand so that we can note that and bring you in the facilitated discussion. So Kanya, I come to you. We understand now what necessitates this new voting system and the process that leads to it. But how do the mechanics of the system actually work? If you could please unpack that for us for about 10 minutes.
Sure. So Prof has already covered some of the things that I was going to speak to, and I'm hoping that in the Q&A session, I can give some insights from some of the electoral reform workshops we've been hosting in partnership with SAIA, where we've been engaging various South Africans from rural communities to your township communities and see what the people are saying about the new changes to the system and what they also think could help improve the electoral system. So I think I'll start off at the local level. So obviously at the local level, you're able to then elect either an actual candidate or a political party. And so what the overall electoral system is trying to do now is to duplicate that at provincial and national level. So now you're essentially voting for parliament twice. So you're going to vote for parliament on the national ballot, which will be for the 200 seats which are allocated for the political parties only. And now for the first time, we're going to have independent candidates on the regional ballot, meaning that independent candidates can now make it onto the parliamentary as part of the 400 national seats, right? And I think what's also important to recognize about this new system is that people are looking at more ways of direct representation, right? Although South Africa has a proportional representation system, people want a system whereby they're able to elect somebody they know. So when we have 400 members of parliament, they are all allocated a constituency. But whether people know who that allocated member of parliament is a bit unclear. So part of the people that we've engaged on the ground have never met their member of parliament, they've never engaged the member of parliament. And so they feel as though having independent candidates on the ballot then allows them to say, this is who I am taking into parliament, and this is exactly, I know exactly who I'm able to hold accountable. I mean, sure, you can get the numbers and the details of the members of parliament online, but how then they engage their constituencies is still very much vague, and it's something that the new electoral system does not give to us. So including independent candidates will then allow people the direct contact with people that they employ, right? So for the first time provincially, we will have independent candidates as well as on the national ballot as well. So this also came because the Constitutional Court sort of felt like people don't have to be part of a political party in order to contest for political power. A lot of the times, the power is always given to political parties more than the citizens. And so concentrating a lot of the and forcing people to run in a political party for power means that people then don't get to elect people directly, right? And it also then has implications on freedom of association. I think that was one of the rulings that the Constitutional Court made. However, there's been a lot of pushback from some people about the new political system because they feel as though it will result in wasted votes, as Prof said, that if you're an independent candidate, you can only take up one seat, and therefore what happens to the rest of the votes, right? But what we've also found through our workshops is that there's a lot of misinformation around elections. So there's the conversation of, if I'm a registered voter and I don't show up on the day of elections, my vote will go to the biggest political party. And so I think part of the electoral system and part of the new changes in the work that must be done by the IEC is to then make sure that they're giving people the correct information. Because people think that if I register to vote and I don't show up, my vote goes to somebody else, which is untrue. Because if you think about the previous election, the 2019 elections, there were 26 million South Africans who were registered to vote. And the total number of people who showed up was 16 million. And so if that was true, the voter turnout would equal to the number of registrations, which is not the case. I also think that with this new electoral system, right, it allows ordinary South Africans to be able to put up their hand and not be bounded by political parties. I think it also allows for more accountability because independent candidates will then be able to table motions in parliament in which political parties will be able to do. But I think one of our key findings from our workshops was the issue around closed party lists and open party lists. So at the moment, South Africa has a closed party list. And one of the things that people, the reason why people are sort of gravitating towards independent candidates is because they feel as though now they're able to have a say on the people. So in South Africa, for example, if the political party I vote for gets proportionally 20 seats, the first 20 people on the party list go into parliament. I don't have a say as an ordinary voter who those 20 people are. And I think that was one of the biggest problems that we found from our workshops, that people feel like they want to have a say in who the people that are going into provincial legislatures are and the people that are going to national parliament. I think one of our biggest findings as well about the new electoral system and what the people are saying was around sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Oh yes, it was around after elections. The conversation around should my party decide to be in coalition with another party, us as the voters, our current electoral system, even with the new amendments, doesn't allow for voters to have a say of, I would like my party to be in coalition with this and this and this party. So if you look at the multi-charter party, for example, all those political parties have decided to be in coalition, but their voters never got an opportunity to choose, do we agree with all these parties in the multi-party charter? Why do we think we should be part of the multi-party charter? And so part of the conversation that needs to lead to new electoral reform needs to be around how do the ordinary voters have a say when it comes to the post-election? So I think pre-election and during election, the Electoral Act sort of covers us, but post-election, how do we then hold our leaders accountable and make sure that the voter still has the power? So the workshop, we titled it, instead of electoral reform, we're calling it power to the voter, to make sure that we also get some sort of power post the elections, because what this electoral system has done is that after the elections, it's sort of left to the political parties to make all of the decisions, and therefore with independent candidates, it feels to them, or they are making the conclusion that it brings more accountability to have independent candidates into the system because they feel like they have direct representation in that manner. I think I'll stop there and then we can go to the Q&A session where I'll be able to share more of the insights from the workshops.
Thank you very much, Kanya. I think your intervention really speaks to the observation that has been made by Prof that, this is a minimalist option. And there's so much work that still needs to go into this reform that will make sure that people really, really do have a say before elections, during elections, and possibly even after elections, which is more important. But before I go to the Q&A, I just want to throw this question to you just for clarification. So an independent candidate can go into the legislature, but can an independent candidate run for president, for example? What does the Act say in that regard?
Okay, sure. So in the way the South African electoral system works right now, when we vote for the national ballot, when we vote on the regional ballot and the national ballot, we are essentially employing 400 potential presidents, because anybody who sits in those 400 seats could be the potential president. And I'll make an example using the Johannesburg mayor situation, where a party that has 2 seats, I think, or 1 seat, was then able to become the mayor. So you must also know that once we vote on the ballot, whether it's on the national ballot or on the regional ballot, we are voting for 400 potential presidents, because it is those 400 people who occupy those 400 seats who will then pick a president for us. And it won't matter if they come from a 2-seat party or a 1-seat party. And that's how an independent candidate could be a president of South Africa, because if they are voted in by the 400 people, then it will be possible.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Kanya. Before I go to our online participants, I'd like to maybe open the floor here in the room first for any kind of very short reflection on the voting system itself, or questions that we want to pose to our 2 speakers, and then I'll go to the questions that we have online. Steve, yes, please go ahead.
Thanks, Stephen Bruce from Science. Thank you very, very much for both of the presentations. I want to ask you, Kanya, have you seen voter education? Is it any different this time from previous elections? Are we seeing more people registering or not?
Thank you. Is there another maybe question or comment from the room before I go to online? Okay. So we have a question, or rather kind of a point for clarification from Anonymous, who says, hello, I thought I could split my votes for the National Assembly between 2 parties that I liked. I have been told that if I vote for one party in the regional list and a different vote for the national list, that because of the subtraction calculation, I am in essence wasting both votes and they will zero out. I know many people are talking about splitting their votes. I can't quite believe this, but would like to hear from maybe the experts in terms of what your view is. So they like to know about splitting their votes. Is that a waste, or is that a method that could work? Mm. So maybe we'll take those 2 questions, and Prof, I'll start with you, Steve's question, and then the question from online.
Yeah, I mean, they're perfectly entitled to split their vote, which is an oddity. Remember, before we had 1 vote that was counted twice, so you couldn't split your vote, but you could vote for different parties or independents in the case of the regional for each half of the National Assembly. It's not a case that one thing cancels out the other. The problem is this, and it's the same problem we've got in local governments. When they calculate overall proportionality, they use all of your votes, which is very odd. They use both your ward votes and the second ballot votes. And they work out what party proportions are overall. I think, and this is what the NAC recommended, that basically, and this is what we have in like the classic additional member system in Germany, it's only the second ballot that should determine proportionality. That means that basically when you're voting in your ward or your local constituency, you're only thinking about who's going to be representing a local constituency. When you vote on the other ballot, you're thinking about who you want running the country. So the problem is at the moment that, like, if you think, okay, in your local government, I want the DA, I like my local DA candidate to represent me locally, but I still want the ANC running the city. Well, your DA vote is contributing to the DA vote across the city, not simply in that ward. So there's a case for splitting the two votes more cleanly, but no, I mean they don't cancel each other out in any sense.
Thank you.
So that's an option. People are going to have to split their votes. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof.
Mm.
Kanya, just to the question Steve posed about the differences that you might have observed now, as well as if you want to chime in as well as the question.
Sure. So I don't think there's been much of a difference. I think we only have 1.7 million more people who have registered. But I think part of the issue is that if you have registered in 2016 or 2019, you stay registered on the system since. So just because we have a 27.7 million registration number, it does not mean that it was people who have recently re-registered. Once you're on the IEC system, you stay on the IEC system. So I think we might just face an issue with turnout once again, because 27.7 million is still low considering there's about 45 million South Africans who are eligible to vote. But what I've found about voter education, particularly this year, is that we've had a huge challenge. People are really confused about the three ballots. I was in Cape Town last week with a group of senior citizens who run an organization in Khayelitsha, and I had to explain the three ballot system multiple times in order for them to understand. I think the fact that there's three ballots is really, one, it's becoming confusing for voters, but two, it's also proving to be an admin nightmare for the IEC, because now all of the ballot, the only ballot that's going to be the same for everybody is the national ballot. All the provincial ballots are going to be different in all the provinces. All the regional ballots are going to be different in all the regions. So I think administratively, it also sort of becomes a nightmare. But I also do think that there needs to be more explanation on what each ballot means to people. So I think people understand that, yes, like one ballot, one vote. I think that's been one of the simplest ways I can try and explain to people. So one ballot, one vote. And on one ballot, you can't vote. So on the national ballot, you can't vote for a political party, and on the same ballot, vote for an independent candidate. So that's also been a point of confusion for people, because they're under the assumption that if I vote for a political party on the same ballot, I can also vote for an independent candidate. So in terms of the voter education, I think there hasn't been enough, but also understandably that the IEC's budget has been cut in some sort of ways. But I also do believe that the IEC is an independent body, and so we all have the responsibility to carry out this voter education and voter conversation around that. There's also been a lot of conversations around rigging of the elections, of which I think we all need to do a very good job of combating that kind of disinformation, because for the past 6 elections that we've had, the IEC has successfully held what I would call a free and fair election. And so there's a lot of conversations around whether this particular election will be rigged, considering that it is 30 years of democracy, considering the fact that there's been a lot of polls that are saying that the ANC is going to drop under 50%. So I think a lot of people are a bit nervous and anxious around the rigging of the elections. So I think more work needs to be done around, one, supporting the IEC, but also two, making sure that there's accurate information that is going around. And that is not a part of voter conversation. I feel like a lot of the voter education is mostly on the three ballots, but I think people also don't understand how the system actually works. So explaining, if you're at a voting station and you are an observer, this is what happens. They count the ballots in front of everybody. So they'll say, do we all agree that these are the number of votes that have been cast? And then they will put the number outside the voting station. So I think the actual process hasn't been explained to people enough. I think one of the key issues as well is conversations around special votes. People haven't communicated. There hasn't been a lot of conversations around the special votes, particularly about the fact that I think initially you were able to vote at any voting station, but now you have to let the IEC know if you would like to vote differently. A lot of people are still not aware about that, and that's a big change from the previous election season. So I think, yes, we are trying to, the focus has been on the 3 ballots because everyone's like, oh, for the first time we're having 3 ballots. But I also think that there's a lot of lower hanging fruit that we need to start discussing as well when it comes to the conversations around voter education.
Thank you so much, Kanya. Maybe to pose the question to both of you, Prof and Kanya. I think the issue of apathetic youth is a contentious one, and that is prevalent across the world, really. What do we say to young people specifically about this new voting system and some of the benefits? I mean, some of them are not aligned to a political party, don't want to vote alongside, along party lines rather. But there's this new voting system now that has independence and it works in the mechanics that you've just explained. What is the one concrete benefit to be able to get young people out of their houses to go vote? So maybe Prof?
Well, I suppose the one thing you could say to them is that if they're ambitious young people, they can try and stand as independents if they're not aligned to any of the political parties. But it's going to require, as it probably should, getting together with other people to mobilize resources to, for example, get the 1,000 signatures and the deposit and so on. It's as it should be, because you can't just have thousands of people on the ballot sheet. That was potentially one of the risks, and one of the reasons why the entry requirements were initially too high. They've actually been lowered, or the qualification requirements. But yeah, you know, there are young people who wanted a way to get into Parliament. I know that when we did our consulting of the public, there were representatives of young people's organisations who said they wanted a way to just be able to stand for Parliament outside parties, and now they've got a way. So I suppose that's what you could say to them.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Kanya, and I think, you know, this speaks to the point that was earlier made by Prof as well, that, you know, the system now allows people to run as candidates, but the number of people who actually did run is significantly lower than what we expected. So as you answer that question, please can you kind of just keep that in mind as well in your response?
So I think the conversation around young people and apathetic youth and elections is a bit of a tricky one, because I do sort of feel that young people in this country feel like they're not getting the democracy dividend. They feel like they're not benefiting from the democracy, and so they're starting to opt out. But also at the same time, I've met a lot of young people in communities across South Africa who are politically involved, just not in the formal kind of politics. And so I definitely agree with Prof that if young people want the opportunity to run, this is the opportunity to run as an independent candidate. Because what we find with party lists is that young people are always relegated to like the youth leagues or the student chapters or things like that. So they don't feel like they have enough representation in the main party list. I mean, if you look at the top 3 political parties and you look at the top 7 people, there's not a single person who's probably below the age of 40 in any of the lists. So young people also feel like they're not represented enough. So maybe one of the ways in which young people can then champion their own issues is to, 1, run independently, but also 2, it's very important for us to show up for ourselves. Nobody's going to champion the issues of young people if we don't champion them ourselves. If we think about the generation of 1976, it was a group of young people who came together to champion issues that affected that entire generation. When we think again to all the student movements that happened, from your Me Too, from your Are You reference list, your roads must fall, your fees must fall, it was again students who were championing young people's issues, and we make up 60% of the population in South Africa. And so we have to then decide, as this generation of 2024 or 2020, whatever, what we would like to champion as our main generational mandate, if we were to call it that. I do think that in our electoral system, it cannot be that the average age in South Africa is 27, but the average age in Parliament is like 57. And so we must also decide what we want from our democracy. Well, how we decide to vote in this election, and particularly in 2026, will then set the trajectory of this country for the next 30 years. And so we will be the ones who are left over, not the 50-year-olds in Parliament. It will be us. And so we must then decide, is this the kind of country we would like to live in the next coming 10 years? Because I think that's a large part of the missing conversation, is that we need to create a better future for ourselves and those who come after us. Because those who are older than us, they need to preserve their legacy, for example. And I also see it in the kind of campaigning. I feel like a lot of campaigning that is done by political parties is not targeted at young people. You see now with the governing parties, they're pulling out all the veterans, they're pulling out the former heads of state. And unfortunately, people of my generation don't relate to those people. It would have made a difference if they pulled out the younger cadres or the younger people that will attract younger people. So I think also there's a missing link between the campaigning that the political parties are doing and the people that they're trying to attract. Because if you're bringing out veterans, to me as a young person, it's saying that you're looking to invoke your older base or your older voter base. And the reality of the situation is that our voter base is aging in South Africa. A large majority of the people who actually registered to vote in South Africa are above the age of 40. It gets very low once you hit the 18 to 19 category and the 29, the 25 to 30 category. So I think we must seriously think as young people about the kind of country that we want to create, and we must all continue to have conversations together, because there's no one man or one person who's going to come with the best solutions. It's all about a collaborative effort towards making sure that our democracy works for all of us.
Yes, thank you so much. Leonardo Fibe online says, Kanye's comments are spot on. There's mass national confusion going around. There's a need across party and institutions for this to kind of rectify the disinformation issue. I think then I want to, like you just said, we all have a collective, it's a collective effort. We all have a role to play in this. So apart from the state actors and the political parties and the IEC, what has been the role of the non-state actors in kind of combating the misinformation? The role of media in trying to kind of spread the correct information and providing that education about this new voting system that you have kind of observed in your work, as well as you had to take trainings in different provinces.
Sure. So part of the things that we have done as the Rivonia Circle is to create several TikToks, because we know that the younger generation is on TikTok, and we know that not a lot of people are into the reading. So we try to make 3-minute explainer videos, 3 ballots in 3 minutes, trying to say, how do you go and cast your vote? What time do voting stations open? We've also tried to create a board game as the Rivonia Circle that speaks to elections, political party manifestos, changes to the system as well. I think it's also very important because people don't know like what time voting stations open. So as I was saying, it's like the little information that we take for granted and we think that people automatically know, right? But also with the media, I think the media has a very important role to play in making sure that people know accurate information about it. So what we have done at the Rivonia Circle, we have tried to work along with media houses to explain the ballots, explain the electoral system, but also I think there hasn't been enough to make sure that misinformation isn't going around. And I'm sorry to mention a specific political party, but what happened with Arise SA, and it's very when people who had been called by the IEC and it was explained to them how the electoral system works, and then once you are no longer on the ballot, you now want to spread false information around that. I think we need to have a real legislative framework. I think part of the IEC's code of conduct should also include how do we control actual candidates who are supposed to be on the ballot, who have now not made it on the ballot and now starting to spread misinformation about that. We don't have legislation to combat misinformation around elections, and misinformation is a very big issue, not only in South Africa, I think in a lot of African countries as well, where you can see people spreading various things. But I do think that universities also need to come on board. I don't think universities are doing nearly as enough to speak about elections. I don't think high schools are doing nearly as enough to speak about elections, because remember that you need to be 16 to be eligible to register. So I think the earlier we start this, the better. One of the key findings actually that we found from the electoral reform workshops that we've had is people asking for a system where as soon as you turn 18, you automatically register to become a voter, because a lot of countries do that. So maybe that could also be a conversation. What would it look like if every citizen in South Africa above the age of 18 was automatically registered? Will it really impact the voter turnout? Because we aren't even guaranteed that if we register everybody automatically above the age of 18, that people will end up showing up to the election anyway. So I think it really speaks to the political culture that we have, and it speaks to our electoral system and the ways in which we need to make sure that it aligns to a lot of young people. So some of the studies we've done have said that young people in this country don't relate to any of the political options, and that can't be. We have over 300 registered political parties. So that means that there's an inherent problem with our political system, with our voting system, as well as our political culture in general.
Thanks, Engel. Prof, Kanye says that universities have a more enhanced role to play in educating on the voter system. I want to throw it to you that I think it's both maybe academia and think tanks. What do you think the specific role of those entities should be? Because we have a crisis on our hands, and I think there needs to be a collective action rather than just relying on the IEC. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, the three ballot system is, I mean, you could see from the outset this was going to cause confusion. And it was going to require more education than ever, not cuts in IEC budgets. And it's interesting also, I mean, it could have also been anticipated that precisely the confusing nature of it was going to result in the development of conspiracy theories. This is all about doing us out of something, etc. The more opaque, the whole question of how do votes translate into seats, the more opaque that is, the more room there is for conspiracy theories. Look, I suppose, I mean, I have been involved, I actually had some early contact with the New Nation movement, which took this whole issue to constitutional thought. So we did set up the odd workshop and conference that's for them. So we've had a very limited contact with that issue. I think there is room for more. I suppose we have traditionally assumed there'd be a division of labour between election workers like is it Kenya? Oh, you can
Yes.
yeah. Between election educators like Kenya and what teaching universities would do. But it does impress upon me that, I mean, in the time left, I think, for example, I should organise a university workshop explaining the voting system, something like that. Yeah, I think it's basically a case for all hands on deck.
Absolutely, we definitely do love action, Prof, and thank you for taking up the challenge. So I'll come back to the floor for some questions and reflections, and I'll start with you, Terence.
Hi, Terence Berrigan, Institute for Race Relations. I was intrigued by the comment about the crisis of representation to the political culture, for various reasons.
Okay.
Here's my question. I think this whole question of electoral reform becomes something of a fetish. You know, like it's the latest silver bullet. And you know, South Africans, I think there is a part of our political culture that's very messianic. You know, we wait for the next big thing. Someone mentioned Khan, you know, and that was kind of a case of, hi, I'm what you will be waiting for, and I'm going to save the country, and I get 0.5%, and I don't bother to go to Parliament's door. And I think this is kind of, you know, what this is kind of stands in that line. But if I think back, and I'm old enough to remember the pre-1994 system, you know, where it was the first past the post constituent, well, if you're white, constituency system, and independents were vanishingly rare. You know, they're vanishingly rare amongst at local government level. And often, you know, looking at some of the manifestos, it's just clear to me these people have no clue about how the system actually works. My point is, you know, what does this actually move the needle, or is our political culture fundamentally rooted in the idea of parties and party dominance? You know that, so you know you can tinker with this, but at the end of the day, it's still being directed from by party machines. Maybe we just aren't in a position where that sort of personal interaction really matters. I think it's also just important to make one final point that voting is like drawing a map. It's a 2D representation of a 3D reality. So, you know, people bitch about, is Africa big enough? Well, that depends on you're going to sacrifice dimensions for, you know, for orientation. It's very much the same thing. In South Africa, you know, because we have a population of what, 60 million, demographics are a bit off. But, you know, we are not going to have a participatory democracy. That's why we have a representative democracy. And I understand what people say, but well, my party might go into coalition with him or her. But that's kind of fundamentally their function. There's a limit to what sort of influence any of us can really have on that on that process, unless you are willing to do the work to sort of get yourself into a position where you can. Anyway, that's my rambling contribution.
So I'll ask the speakers to note that observation and question while I go to Simpiwe.
So I have two questions. So one is, what does the new ballot system mean for our local and municipal elections that happen in between the national ones? And then the second question is, when we're speaking on young people, how do we try and change the culture of being reactive towards increasing voter participation? Because I think when it comes to increasing democratic literacy in the country, we wait for voting system season to happen before we actually start having these conversations on democracy and engaging it and making it that elections are the pillar of democracy, when democracy constitutes a lot more than just voting. So how do we change the reactive nature of our democratic literacy system?
Thank you, Simpiwe. I'll read a question, or yes, it's a question that came from virtual. How are regions' constituencies determined for the regional ballot? And if an independent candidate is listed on more than one regional ballot, will all votes supporting those candidates from different regional ballots contribute to them gaining a seat? Or votes for independent candidates separated per region, only being able to gain seat from votes cast in one region, probably the region in which they gave the most votes. I think we did touch upon that, but I guess for clarity, I would ask that you also touch on that again. So I'll start with you, Prof, for your answers, and then I'll come back to you, Kanye.
Yeah, I mean, I fundamentally agree with a lot of what you're saying. I also remember the old voting system in South Africa, and it's the same as in the UK or the United States.
Yeah.
It wasn't always the same in the United States to the same degree, because there tended to be a weak party system. But now, even in the United States, basically, even if you've got first past the post, parties dominate. Modern democracy is party democracy. This is one of the most basic facts of comparative political science, even though political scientists have been talking for decades now about party de-alignment, loss of party loyalty. The fact is that the party is an essential mechanism of modern democracy, modern mass democracy. And I don't think independents are going to move the needle very much for reasons I've explained, especially since prominent individuals who want to get into parliament have got the option of forming one-man band parties that, if they are prominent enough individuals, give them a decent chance of getting into parliament, a better chance than they would have as independents. Local elections, the recent reforms don't affect local elections in any way at all. In fact, some people see local elections, as a model of some sort, as one possible model. And yeah, as to the question about independence, absolutely right. Independents can stand in as many regions as they want, but they can only win in one region, and all the votes that they get in other regions are discarded. Or in fact, yeah. So basically, there's no possibility of the votes you have in different regions being accumulated. It's one of the ways in which excess votes. There are two ways excess votes get wasted. One is that if you stand in more than one province, your votes in all the other provinces are discarded. The other is that if you win votes surplus to what's required for a seat, those votes get discarded. As Kanye said, it's important for people to understand that your surplus votes are not going to parties. What's happening is that they're just being discarded, and the voting pool is being readjusted. So the parties then compete for a readjusted voting pool in which the votes for the independents are no longer there. Yeah. Yeah, you've got to win it. If you want to win in parliament as an independent, you've got to win a region, a single region.
Thank you very much, Prof. Kanya. I think if you want to add to those, you certainly can. But there's still questions that were posed by Simpiwe as well. Should I have anything to address?
So in terms of local government, the new system doesn't really mean much for local government. I think the way that local government runs the elections could potentially be the way that I, in my personal capacity, think that perhaps we can look at running the national and provincial elections that way. In terms of changing the culture in young people, so the way in which I engage with people my age and I explain to them the democracies is to say that we have a toolbox in the democracy, and it's called the democracy toolbox. You have the elections, you have protesting, you have petitions, you have laws and bills. And so we need to make sure, when should we use the correct tools? I think South Africa has an abnormally high levels of protests. I think we have about 27 a day. And so I think maybe we can put down the protest tool for now. I think the time has come for us to use the election tool. And the thing is with the election tool is that young people always feel as though people attach service delivery to their vote. So in a lot of our workshops, people will say, even if I go vote, it won't change the service delivery that I get. A lot of people are also, there's been a lot of intimidation by political parties to say that you won't get a job if you don't vote for us. So I think part of the issue around engaging young people and changing the culture around young people, particularly with young people where there's such high levels of unemployment, it cannot be that you are using employment as a ploy to get young people to come out to vote. I do think that we need to have an honest conversation about young people about the general culture and us not showing up for ourselves. Because whether we like it or not, the people who show up will be the people who count. It's not, we have to show up for ourselves, we have to show up for our community, we have to show up for our families. Because whether you show up or not, South Africa also doesn't have a law that says if all of us in this room go and vote tomorrow, it will be the government that we get, whether we like it or not. We don't have a minimum number of people that need to show up in order for the election to be deemed free or fair. So I think part of engaging young people is to then say that you need to then have you. I like the IEC's slogan of this year of your democracy, own it. We need to bring back the culture of saying that this is our country. Nobody else is going to fix this country but us. And it goes back to the political culture that you were talking about, Prof, about thinking that there's this one man figure who's going to fix this country for us. Even apartheid was not fixed or done by Nelson Mandela himself. It was done by citizens of this country. And the way that we must think about it is that South Africa is a house and we all live in this house. We've been living in this house for 30 years. The house needs a bit of maintenance. We're all sitting in the house, we're all complaining about it. We can all see that the house is not so well kept. And so it has to be, we all live in this house, including the political parties, including the heads of state. And therefore it's our responsibility, the people who live in this house, to fix it. We can't expect just 400 people who live in the house to fix it when there's 60 million of us who live in the house. And so it's also our collective responsibility to go out and vote. I think we speak a lot about the right to vote, but we don't speak enough about the responsibility to vote and the responsibility that we have as citizens to make sure that the country functions the way that it's supposed to be. Also, on the independent candidates, I don't think it would be wise for an independent candidate to contest in multiple provinces. I think rather use the support that you can garner to contest for one region, because again, as Prof said, it will then be wasted votes, of which it doesn't help with much.
Thank you very much, Kanya. Bulelani Mlweni online says, chaos and confusion at times means some form of an opportunity for someone. Who stands to benefit from all the confusion and in what possible ways? And Kanya, I'd like to throw that question perhaps to you and ask that when you've answered that question, maybe give us your final parting shots. I think you've already given us a call to action that put down the protest tool and engage the election tool. What other action would you call for as we lead up to the 29th of May?
So with the confusion, I think contrary to popular belief, it's not the political parties who benefit either, because I think if people are confused when it comes to voting day, we may have a situation of spoiled ballots, of which doesn't help our overall thing that we are trying to do. I think ours is to just make sure that we minimize the confusion that is there and make sure that people are really making an informed decision on the day that they go and vote. But I do think that going into these elections, my last parting shot would really to be a deep reflection on the 30 years of democracy. I think it's very significant that this election is falling on 30 years of democracy. And I mean, of course, there has been some progress, but I think that over the past 15 years of our democracy, there's been a lot of stagnation. And so I think as citizens, we then need to think about 30 years of democracy and think about how do we get out of this stagnation? Because even with all the reform policies that we've had, the last 15 years are sort of overshadowing any kind of progress that we made, any kind of reform policy that we've made. And so I think we need to seriously talk about how do we change the system, how do we change our institutions in a way that will benefit all of us as citizens of this country.
Thank you so much, Kanya. Prof, in your earlier intervention, you spoke to the similarities between what South Africa is trying to do with its voting system to be very similar to that of Romania. You know, now having unpacked all the challenges, disinformation, confusion, spoiled ballots, etc., is there anything that we could kind of learn from Romania, who has an established system, and also your parting shot, please?
The comment about Romania was, I know very little about the Romanian voting system, apart from the fact that it's also a system in which independents compete against parties on a closed party list, but ballot system. So that's really the only thing I know about Romania. So I don't think the major lessons I can bring you from there But, I mean, we do look at voting. See, it isn't a natural voting system optional, but it's a sort of thrown together thing. So that's why there's only one other country that has something like that. That's assuming that Romania still has that system. We looked at other systems around the world. A lot of the majority of the Ministerial Advisory Committee was attracted to something like the German system, which is a variation of something that we've got in local government. But as we know from local government, it's not going to be a panacea. But it does. See, I mean, the thing about electoral systems, there isn't a perfect electoral system. There are different values, democratic values that you want your electoral system to realize. Two of the common ones are representativity, as in fairly representing all the elements of the country, and the other is accountability. There's often a degree of trade-off between the two. One of the attractions of the German mixed member system, is that it combines a degree of direct election and accountability of individuals with overall proportionality. So it's this mixed system is a way of trying to get the best of both worlds. We have a version of it in local government. I think there would have been a strong case for introducing that in national government, which the government chose not to do so. But we'll have to see that the debate is supposed to be an ongoing one because of this new committee that's been set up.
Great, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, both in the room and those joining us virtually. We heard in the first session from Prof. Daryl Glaser and Tanya Burns. A round of applause for them, please. We will now take a very short comfort break, and we will be resuming at 13:30. So if you're joining us online, please be back at 1:30, and we'll be going into our second session that's comparing party manifestos and extracting some foreign policy objectives from them. Again, thank you very much. We are back from our coffee break and we welcome everybody who is still joining online to the second session. We're also going to be comparing party manifestos to scout out foreign policy objectives. I think foreign policy has always been seen as an ivory tower, but I think there's a couple of significant global events that have kind of helped to change the way in which we view foreign policy at a domestic level. If we look at how the COVID-19 pandemic kind of played itself out globally and some of the positions that were taken in response to that, if we look at the Russia invasion of Ukraine and how that kind of played itself out in the domestic aspects of South Africa's politics, I think there's key things that we can extract there. And I think more recently, it's also been the Israel-Palestine conflict. But without limiting those to those particular events, I just do want to emphasize that foreign policy has kind of come out domestically as a very important pillar in which we also look at who to vote for. But before we get to that, we'll hear a presentation from Nicholas Bauer, who will take us through some of the comparisons, and then we'll have discussants that will react to his presentations. And that will take us to the end of the second session after the Q&A. So without further ado, Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm trying to open my presentation that I've given to Isabel on the flash drive. And while she's trying to repair it, I'm going to unfortunately have to wing it. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I mean, I'm here basically based on the fact that Konrad Adenauer Foundation paid for me to put together this election guide, which is basically a very, very simple, accessible guide for all parties that are on offer. This election, it was written before political manifestos are actually released. And it looks to delve a little bit deeper into the parties based on the fact that manifestos are very often election gimmicks. The earth can be promised right before an election, especially the parties that aren't going to be in government. They won't have a bite of government's cherry, are able to make all sorts of promises without any real responsibility to deliver on them. To give you a bit of background about why I decided to write this book, I mean, it's pretty clear that South Africa's electoral turnout is trending downwards. We are in the 50s. You compare 2019 to 1994, we were very, very healthily about 70%. That picture gets even worse when you look at the overall voting eligible population. Thank you very much, Isabel. Much appreciated. So yes, as I was saying, in 1994, close to 80% voter turnout, and that's trending downwards. Mid-50s in 2019. You look at the local government election as well, it was below 50%, although we do know that local government elections is a low turnout. And then when you look at the overall voter eligible population, it gets very, very alarming. The South Africans that are eligible to vote, less than half are actually turning up to a ballot box on election day. And that's particularly serious when it comes to your younger segment of the voting population, 18 to 35. So essentially, this little booklet is a simple reference for all voters to explore the parties in offer and reveal their policy standpoints on key issues in South African society. I had a look at the parties. Many people wondering why I chose these specific parties. Well, it's parties that are already represented in Parliament and those that are polling to be in Parliament post May 29th, the likes of Botha, the likes of Rising Mzansi, and indeed the Patriotic Alliance. People ask me why I didn't include Mkhonto we Sizwe in this book. Like I said, it was written towards the end of last year. And Jacob Zuma's latest political project didn't really come to fruition until the end of the year. Luckily though, it's been made into a podcast with Scroller Africa, and it's fully available on Spotify. So if you really want to know what MK thinks on key issues, you can head over to the podcast. The issues that I looked at, the obvious one, job creation, economic growth, housing, safety and security, education, energy, mineral resources, as well as also look at things like climate change and LGBTIQA plus issues, tourism, and also artificial intelligence as well. So I've had a look, obviously presentation usually focuses on their client manifestos, but I've zoned in on the international race relations aspect for this presentation. African National Congress, their foreign policy is driven by the Freedom Charter with a strong focus on human rights for all. They call for a respect for national sovereignty and commitment to peace. High on their agenda is African integration, in relation to the African Continental Free Trade Area, and advancing the AU's Agenda 2063. They're also committed to developing a stronger voice for developing nations at the United Nations. Official opposition Democratic Alliance, economic growth, job creation, and universal human rights is the cornerstone of their foreign policy. Essentially, though, they want to maintain the post-World War II democratic order and expand ties with historical trading partners, the European Union and the USA, as opposed to expanding the BRICS bloc and seeking out newer trading partners. Third biggest party, Economic Freedom Fighters, they've made it pretty clear that they're Africa-focused and strongly anti-colonial. They call for continental solidarity, regional integration, and economic cooperation. The interesting thing that they've consistently called for for the past 10 years, the introduction of Kiswahili as a compulsory academic offering at the country's universities. They want to reshape international relations to favor the global south. Freedom Front Plus, of course, quite a surprise the last election. They bounced into the National Assembly with many more seats than they were predicting. Their foreign policy pragmatism over historical ties related to the apartheid struggle. Again, also supposing that we should, or implying that we should try and develop the existing relationships that we have with Western nations. They do call for support for African development, but that support for development and security should be based on the rule of law and not propping up what they call out-of-order governments. And they also want to see our foreign relations driven by trade balances and self-determination, not with nations relying on South Africa for their bread and butter. Inkatha Freedom Party, also a conflict resolution and collaboration to address global challenges and disputes. Very, very bland foreign policy, if I don't mind me saying. Peacekeeping and economic partnerships within SADC solely based on regional stability and prosperity, not necessarily on historical ties. The African Christian Democratic Party, also much of the same, really. They call for the upholding of sovereignty and legitimately established and internationally recognized nation states. Of course, tipping their hat there to Israel. They call for diplomacy and dialogue over conflict and trade wars, and also for a skills audit in all South Africa's embassies and missions. And I press them on that. Does this mean that you want to cut down on the diplomatic mission that South Africa has? South Africa, comparatively, for our development, has a very, very, very big diplomatic mission. And they said, no, it's just about having people who are fit for purpose in our consulates and our embassies. The United Democratic Movement, also international cooperation and regional stability. They specifically call for non-interference in internal affairs of other nations, and they want pragmatic diplomacy driven by peace-building, human rights, and economic partnerships. Good wants to see South Africa make more of its non-aligned multilateralist stance for a less Western-centric international system. They want this pursuit to be based on international law, though, and they see South Africa having a very special role as a regional and international peace broker based on our negotiation out of apartheid. Pan-Africanist Congress, much like the EFF, radical anti-imperialism based in solidarity with African nations. They explicitly call for the collapsing of all borders in Africa to enable free movement and trade, infrastructure investments to enhance Afro-continental connectivity as well. Congress of the People, believe it or not, they do have a foreign policy, human rights-based approach based on pragmatism once again. They want to accelerate Afro-continental development through trade. Al-Jama'ah, they also call for the African Union to have the same offering as the European Union in terms of free movement of goods and people, calling for greater continental integration for South Africa's economic and social benefit. They vehemently oppose global Zionism, they say, and call for the supplying of weapons to Palestinian liberation movements. African Transformation Movement, also very, very focused on African integration. Their foreign policy, they say, is based on industrialization and strengthened ties with BRICS, as well as broaden the African continental free trade agreement and strengthen that as well. The Patriotic Alliance sees South Africa as having a neutral role as peacemaker and negotiator, also based on our history as negotiating our way out of apartheid. They very on brand with their xenophobic stance towards South African politics, reparations from nations with citizens illegally in South Africa, and they would also restore full relations with Israel. One of the handful of parties on offer that openly support Israel. Action SA, also fairly bland and straightforward foreign policy driven by human rights and pragmatism. Once again, that word pragmatism is a lot, you hear a lot in all of these approaches to foreign policy. They want diplomacy to end aggression, oppression, and discrimination. And they say that they'll pursue any economic or any foreign relationship rather based on mutually beneficial trade, not on historical ties. That South Africa has. The Bill in South Africa is quite a mouthful of foreign policy. They want foreign policy prioritizing constitutionalism, multilateralism, pan-Africanism, Ubuntu, and democracy. I'm not too sure exactly how they would do such a thing, but I suppose the benefit of two things there. I think they're pretty certain that they're not going to be in a position to implement that. And I suppose this is also quite on brand with a party that calls himself radical centrist. Economic integration and sustainable migration on the continent, so not necessarily completely shutting up South Africa's borders, but pragmatic immigration is what they're calling for, and they're calling for democratic reforms within SADC specifically. New kid on the block, Rise Mzansi, foreign policy driven by the promotion of human rights and economic pragmatism. Again, pragmatism once more, broader cooperation on the African continent specifically, and the globe in general. They want to call for a diversification of trade relations to avoid an East and West conflict. And South Africa kind of playing both teams there with our relationship with BRICS nations. But of course, the fact that we are in many ways still seen as this gateway into Africa, even though our relations with Western nations may be fraying somewhat in comparison to historically speaking. And then last but not least, Mkhonto we Sizwe, well, they are vehemently anti-imperialist. They call for an assertive approach seeking fairness and mutual respect in their foreign policy. They call for regional stability and cooperation. Closer cooperation with BRICS is what they put as their cornerstone of foreign policy. And they would immediately review all accords and treaties with Western nations. One wonders, though, why this didn't happen when Jacob Zuma was head of state, as the leader of the African National Congress. But let's look at the commonalities here. So every single party that has submitted a manifesto to fight elections wants to see stronger relations with Africa, and that is more or less a given. However, when it comes to practical measures, like maybe free movement of goods and people, it's only a handful: ATM, UDM, EFF, Ultramar, and PAC. More or less, the remainder are all calling for a strengthening of African ties based on trade, based on mutual beneficial treaties and so on. Those calling for BRICS expansion is more or less in the majority, not across the board. Your likes of the DA, Freedom Fund Plus, and others not calling for expansion into BRICS. And then solidarity with Palestine, more or less those parties that you find in the center of left economic spectrum. The solidarity with Palestine, well, I mentioned earlier, the ACDP openly supporting Israel alongside the Patriotic Alliance. And of course, also the Freedom Front Plus and BOSA. There's only a handful of parties left that also still want to leave the International Criminal Court. ATM, Al-Janmar, EFF, PAC, and Mkhonto we Sizwe. And that is all she wrote in terms of the key takeaways from foreign policy positions of the parties that are challenging the 29 May elections.
Thank you very much for that illuminating presentation. I think that was really fascinating, the comparative study that you did as well, in terms of where certain parties align themselves in certain issues of foreign policy. I will now bring in the discussants for the session, and I'd like to kind of just maybe change this program around slightly. We have a foreign policy experts, and we have experts as well who are going to be giving us kind of an overview from a youth perspective. So I'd like to, Simpiwe, bring you in first in reaction to Nicholas's presentation to give us your reflections on, what have been the sentiments and the views of kind of like these issues from a youth perspective. I'll bring in Gustavo next to kind of also provide his overview in response to the presentation, and then Tamsin, you can come in to kind of solidify the discussions. So Simpiwe, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I think I'll start off with the relationship that we as South African youth have with foreign policy, specifically looking at our engagement with the Paris Agreement, as well as the Beijing Declaration for Women and Gender, and how we've used those two documents to sort of help us write the South African Youth Climate Action Plan and South African Youth Gender Action Plan. And we're currently also looking into doing work with youth, peace, and security. What I find very interesting about the foreign policies is, while a lot has been spoken about on peace and security within South Africa's relation, not very much has been said with how we look at gender and climate and our relationship with those documents as well, specifically with the relationship that we have created as young people with those specific platforms, namely climate and gender, and having built a youth diplomacy, a youth diplomat group that actually attends COP on a yearly basis and very minimal interaction with not just the political parties, but also the current running government with young people and what we've already done. It still sits at a very tokenistic level and not actually listening to the content that we've created and how we've engaged with them. So it's not really a question per se, but more a comment on what I've noted around the political scale with youth engagements and foreign policies.
Thank you so much, Simpiwe. Gustavo, we've really heard about where political parties kind of align themselves in foreign policy issues. Simpiwe has thrown a spanner in the works because she's introduced also the concept of climate that hasn't been captured by these political parties. And Nicholas, you will correct us if we're wrong here, if they covered that at all in terms of the Paris Agreement and
Well, I included that in the chapter on energy specifically. There's a broad agreement. There's no political party in South Africa that does not believe that there's climate change. It's just about the approach to it. For instance, Mkhonto we Sizwe would cancel all independent power producer programs and sweat the Eskom fleet, so to speak. Whereas, there's broad alignment in the likes of good democratic alliance, Freedom Front Plus, in terms of slowly phasing out coal, but doing so in a way that it doesn't harm South Africa's economic standing. So, apologies for that oversight. It's covered in the chapter on energy. But look, there is a broad understanding that there is climate change. Nobody's saying that it's number jumbo like certain politicians in the USA and elsewhere. But from an approach as to how we phase out so-called dirty energy like coal, it's a very, very, very diverse set of opinions. Also, for instance, is one party that stuck out in my mind specifically stating that they would want to pursue the building of 5 nuclear power stations. Obviously, public procurement being very, very open and transparent. But yeah, broad consensus on the existence of climate change, just about how to skin the cat with difference.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Simpiwe, I'd like you to keep that comment in mind because I will be coming back to you at a later stage. Gustavo, we've heard about multilateralism, we've heard about more alignment with the African continent and the global south. We've heard some parties speaking to wanting more relationships with Western countries, etc. What's your take?
First of all, thank you, Nicholas, for the document. I thought it was a particularly useful way into looking into elections and kind of looking into these bird's eye views, how different parties, in a way, look compared to one another in terms of their own views. And I think it's often quite interesting on the foreign policy space, because foreign policy, it's usually, in most countries, not a major electoral issue. It's not something that usually turns one party versus the other. But we also know that foreign policy has gained a notoriety in the last couple of years in South Africa, and it becomes more familiar for certain groups within South Africa, certain topics. If we look into the last few years, from the invasion of Ukraine to conflicts in the Middle East to the bilateral relations with the US and the West, issues related to immigration, issues related to the environment. So to a certain degree, I think we're finally in a moment where many of these foreign policy issues are somehow discussed within society. They're somehow debated. But we are yet to see, I think, most political parties really looking into foreign policy beyond the big cliches or the big themes. And so the question for me, and I think you mentioned that within your presentation, is while I think a lot of them have a degree of reflection on what is the role of South Africa and what is our position in the world, and I think it's an important one to have. The question on the how often feels that it's missing, and I think has partially to do on our own political dynamics in the last 30 years. Traditionally, for many countries, foreign policy is something that is designed and developed by the executive, not so much within the legislative. When we have a situation where we effectively had one party state, in the sense of one party had the ability within Parliament, within the International Relations Committee, to pass any bill that they would, in principle, present. And then I think it's where a lot of this debate can become, I think, a bit more sophisticated moving forward. We should have an interesting triangulation of three big players in the coming years. The executive as in the role of the presidency, the executive as in the role of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, but certainly a much more active, or in principle, more active role of the Parliament itself and the International Relations Committee within the Parliament. And for that to happen, I think the level of discussions within Parliament needs to increase and improve. I think for those of us that looked into discussions and debates within Parliament on any given international relations issues, the quality of the debate is usually incredibly poor. Often very much based on some catchphrases, big principles, and ideas that becomes sometimes even hard to see how the parties actually disagree with one another. It's easier when we're talking about slightly more ideological positions, whether it's positions on anti-imperialism or positions around closer relations with the West. But when it comes to issues around African integration, those issues are far more practical and far more related to action that needs to be done on a daily basis. So I think this broad nature of foreign policy debates as a society, to a certain degree, there are some opportunities because we have not only a more fragmented and divided views within the political parties, but also in the sense that we start looking a bit more into a player that most of us in the foreign policy field tend to ignore, but it's Parliament. And then, of course, you have the role of not only the Department of International Relations and Cooperation as DIRCO, but also depending on the results of the elections, what will be the splits and which political parties are going to be controlling different departments. We have a notorious problematic in interdepartmental relations within the South African government at the moment, when there is largely one political party controlling most of the departments. That has some really important risks and potential risks in terms of the way that our foreign policy is presented. And if we look into, in the last 2 years in particular, the different positions and views that Department of Defense and the Department of International Relations had when it comes to the issue of the conflict in Ukraine, that had direct implications on how our external partners looked into us. Because if we are to look in terms of the positions and views that DIRCO presented on Ukraine, for instance, they were fairly consistent internally within a particular department, despite the fact there was different views around that. The positions and actions that were taken by DoD often were in opposites to that, and that element of in foreign policy confusion and uncertainty can have really difficult results in terms of how we're engaging with external partners. And we saw that last year with the bilateral relations with the United States, but even the bilateral relations with countries like Russia, where everyone was somehow confused on where do we stand and who do we like and who do we don't. the changes that were made from June last year were changes far more procedural than they were in terms of substance. But those effectively created quite important changes on the way that the Americans looked into us, far less combative and far less frustrated with our positions internationally, but at the same time, also this idea that what does that non-alignment, and I think this is one of these concepts that are often quite presented by a lot of the political parties very openly, identifying a degree of consensus in some of those views is quite important. I think when we're looking to the principles, I think there is limited surprise in how the political parties look into those principles. Some of them are constitutional principles, so they're fairly easy to support and they're fairly easy to present. We want human rights, we want Ubuntu, we want African integration and so on. But once again, some of the larger parties tend to have a slightly deeper view in terms of what do they mean by some of those things. And I think perhaps using those as a starting point for a broader societal dialogue can be important. It's interesting for me to see that some topics that historically had a lot of attention and focus from South Africa don't necessarily appear in all of the political parties. One of them is peace and security, and the role of South Africa as a security guarantor within the continent, as a supporter of conflict resolution. Of course, it still gets presented by many, but not as much as one would expect if we look into the historical importance of this topic. I think Siphiwe mentioned another topic that when I was reading your documents and looking into the different political parties is the issue of gender. Because gender and issues around gender-based violence are important for South Africa, not only from a domestic point of view, but it's something that South Africa very actively has pursued in the last couple of years internationally as one of the big entry points and principles of engagement, not because South Africa perceives that it's perfect in terms of its own domestic dynamics, but it does feel there is certain elements within our democracy and things that internationally we need to bring certain coalitions of countries around that. And that for me was somehow important. Just to conclude, I think there is something that I think the 29th of May will bring from domestic constituencies, from domestic discussions, and of course, all of the political parties tend to look into the same thing, economic growth and jobs as kind of being these easy cross-cutting issues. I think the big question then is to how do we use foreign policy as a tool towards that big priority? And I think that is something that linkage between reflecting not only on who we are as an African country, as a Southern African country, as a global South country, as a country of democratic values, and all of those multiple identities that we somehow navigating with, but it's really thinking about the way in which the world is constructed at the moment, where you have two very large powers like the United States and China that in many ways are peer competitors. There's in many ways are countries that are not only divided amongst themselves, but create fairly valid and complicated decisions for a country like South Africa. When we trade a lot with the West, but we also trade a lot with non-Western countries. So what decisions are we making them in terms of who can we actually engage? How does it actually benefit in terms of the overall societal objectives, but at the same time that it doesn't create compromises, value compromises that the country is not necessarily willing to do. But once again, thank you very much. I thought it was a really informative, really very interesting way of presenting how different political parties look into that. And I think it's certainly something that we probably as a society are going to start looking far deeper in the future as we look in terms of the current political trends in the country. Thanks.
Thank you, Gustavo, and Tamzin, I'll be with you in 1 second. But just from your intervention, I think it's quite clear that issues of foreign policy have come into the mainstream because of certain things that have kind of happened, either domestically or internationally, but has spoke over this domestically. I think, these things have the power to actually make people change who they align with in terms of political parties based on the positions that they take. And also issues of ideology are polarizing, all right? But this is certainly something that is not unique to South Africa. We are experiencing something very interesting and different in this particular election. But surely it's not unique to South Africa. Is there any other kind of country that we can compare this to? And we have the benefit of you being an expert on both South Africa and Brazil. Is this something that happens in Brazil as well? You know, is this foreign policy features a lot in how our constituents vote for political parties? Just what is your sense on that in just the next 3 minutes?
Yeah, no, let me try to be quite brief, and I think it's an important question. And I think if you ask the example of Brazil, I think there is some similarities, I think, particularly when it comes to the fragmentation of political parties. But at the same time, I think foreign policy to a certain degree remains that they usually are more important things for citizens. There is often that question, and we've seen that with some political adverts in the last couple of months, where questions about why are we focusing so much on certain foreign policy issues. So to a certain degree, I think often the more fragmented political environments become, I think in a space where we are now, people are looking into specific hotspots and issues that are often not even seen for many as foreign policy issues. I think the issue Israel and Palestine for many South Africans tend to have a historical and domestic dynamics of how this is thought. So I think the case of Israel Palestine is slightly different. I think when people were looking into Ukraine, for instance, a lot of the responses were fairly transactional in terms of you're winning or losing. There was an element of values within that, but the big reaction came when, from a transactional point of view, we may be losing some of our partners at the moment. Thus, we need to change those. I think it has to do about, we spoke earlier about voter education. I think there is an importance of political party education when it comes to international relations, so that it enables those to understand with a slight higher degree of nuance how international relations issues actually normally evolve. And I think for those of us that work with those issues, we know there is very rarely a black and white or one or the other, this kind of like binary thinking. There's only two options for us in that sense. And I think, and finally, I think there is a role of whichever government is in power. And I think the lack of clarity that we had for a number of years, and I think particularly in 2022 and first half of 2023, had quite a damaging effect. Because to a certain degree, the lack of control of narrative meant that there was at least 20, 30, 100 different narratives floating around about what South Africa was doing, to whom South Africa was doing. We saw that a simple direction of slight more clarity and more direct engagements with multiple parties, with multiple partners, how much that had an impact on stabilizing South Africa's position in the region and in the world. And I don't think it's enough, but I think those elements is something that certainly can and should be the role of parliament, can and should be the role of political parties, to not only provide different solutions and alternatives, which is part of their role, but also increase the pressure on whichever government is in power to make sure that our positions are clear, predictable, and that is understood by all parties most.
Absolutely. With all of that, Tamsin.
Yeah, sure.
With all of that, if you could just maybe chime in as well in terms of your response.
Sure. I mean, a lot of this will have a youth lens, but I think the one thing that underpins a lot of the discussions we've been having is this assumption that it's a lack of understanding of the manifestos that's leading to the low turnout. So I think it is worth reflecting on some of the youth narratives that are coming out around, like, no one actually aligns to what I want. Or things like, I don't trust that you're actually going to implement what you say. So it's all fine and well for you to say it in your manifesto. And so this is incredible work, Nicholas. Thank you so much for bringing it to us. And I think it adds a lot of value to a very specific audience. But I think the everyday citizen, I think it is still worth reflecting on how manifestos are understood. Like, are we using jargon? Are we presenting in people's local home languages? There's a lot of nuance in these sort of things that people might not understand. And the complexity and time you need to commit to understanding it is one that the everyday citizen probably doesn't have. Like, it's a lot of mental burden to do. So that's the one idea. The next is actually, I think there's some really cool other ways that people are learning about manifestos. So for example, there was a website going around which is like a speed dating website where they'd ask you a whole bunch of questions and you'd say, yes, I like this and this sort of theme, this and this sort of theme, and then it would suggest a political party for you to date per se, and then you investigate a little bit more, see if there's some alignment, if you'd like to make a commitment, that sort of thing. But also speaking about how youth are talking about manifestos on TikTok. There are so-called, perhaps there are political commentators who are unpacking these manifestos in everyday language for people to understand. And I think that's also worth some reflecting on. Maybe Kanya can also speak about what influence that's had and how much we can trust the input that they're giving. And again, speaking to the accountability, so how do we hold these parties accountable for their manifestos once they do potentially get into office? Because there are going to be priorities, there are bureaucratic and institutional hurdles that they need to cross, which could prevent a lot of these things from happening, even if they do have those good intentions of implementing. And then the very last one, I think it's worth speaking about the role of SIRE as a public policy think tank and what the youth program does. So a lot of what we do is try to get youth to understand why foreign policy is so important to their everyday lives. And one of the ways we're doing this is we're moving away from only doing negotiation simulations in model United Nations formats, but we're doing model African Union, we're doing model BRICS, we're doing model G20. So trying to make people understand those systems a little bit more and how they can actively have a role in it is something that I think a lot of community-based organizations and think tanks could be doing a little bit better.
Thank you, Tamsin. Now, Simpiwe, I come back to the earlier question that I had kind of for you,
Yes.
and it's a practical one, really. The question was about how we engage or how the parties engage with the issues of climate change and the Paris Agreement. Now, the question back to you in the work that you do at Youth and SIRE, to what extent do the young people you work with actually refer to the foreign policy positions, to the extent to even look at climate issues that are dealt with by different political parties to inform who they're going to be voting for, at the very least?
I did a lot. So to give just a practical example, last week we were invited to a event hosted by the Mavericks, where they had certain political parties there to sort of speak on their candidacy as premier. And there were quite a few young people, a lot of them in high school. And the questions that were asked were very much based on the climate policies of specific political parties, looking at those who are running for candidacy within the Gauteng. So, for example, during that time, Johannesburg was having an issue with the water and asking what exactly you're doing about the water issue that we're facing. Another question that was asked was on clean air and walkable cities and cleaner cities. So that engagement is there and the questions are being asked. It's just the engagement we received back from the political parties was where it was very minimal. It was very, read what we've written, but we have. And that's why we're asking you about what you've written, because there's very little engagement in what you've written about the air quality of our city, about the pollution in our city, about the water in our city, the very practical things that we see on a day-to-day basis as young people.
Sure, Tamsin?
If I can add a quick one on that, I think our youth policy committee tries very hard to not be political party oriented, engage at that scale. Their kind of ethos and mentality is whoever is in power, we're going to hold you accountable for it. And a really good example of this is actually our youth have written part of the city of Johannesburg's climate action plan. So it doesn't particularly matter who goes into power, our youth still try and use the existing mechanisms of stakeholder engagement and engaging with policy and doing those statements from a youth perspective. So that avenue exists and extends to active citizenry beyond election.
Great, fantastic. Thank you very much. We are now going to move to the question and answer segment of the session. And I'd like to maybe start in the room first. If you have any questions or comments. Yes, Terence, please go ahead.
Okay. I found this interesting. I think that for reasons that were outlined, the fact that this is an executive prerogative, it's not something that I think is going to swing anyone's vote. I was actually contacted by a newspaper, and they said, well, you know, Israel, Gaza. And I said, look, if that's what you're voting on, you probably made your choice 20 years ago, and it's highly unlikely that anything happening now. What this does do, I think, is it can ramp up temperatures. You know, but it's more a case of stigmatizing your opponent, that Your opponent is not just is not just a fellow citizen with a different idea. It's a morally decrepit person, and that is a very, very dangerous place to go. And I think it's been some incredible irresponsibility, particularly around that issue in South Africa. But here are two things. First of all, I think that South Africans as a country tend to be very parochial, and I think one caution that I've made this publicly, and so it's in my own writing, is that there's a sense of South Africa has this history, and we can understand the whole world around it. Everything is apartheid. That's sort of the sort of macro framework. It's Israel, it's apartheid. It's America, it's apartheid. It's whatever, or Cuba helped us against apartheid, etc., etc., etc. The thing is that I think that it's a very small-minded and counterproductive way of seeing the world, because you're essentially prejudicing your foregrounding your own prejudices, and I think that leads to a lot of big optical illusions. The other thing I would say is there is this view that South Africa has this wonderful ability to negotiate, and we must go and spread across the world. So, no, sorry, South Africa does not. South Africa achieved a transition because everyone's backs are against the wall. People forget that South Africa in 1990 was effectively bankrupt. What you had was a government that basically knew the game was up and was willing to step back. South Africa post 1994, I think one thing about our political culture it is just the extent to which the incumbent government has often refused to negotiate on major issues. The other, and if I can just segue into something else, this idea that we are going to expand trade and it all, it's another South African pathology, the idea that the government can do it all for you, which I think also gets into, oh, well, I'm not going to vote because the government didn't give me a job. The reason you don't have a job is because we've had anemic economic growth for 30 years. There it is. Because we have a lousy education system. Because we've because economically we're regressing. Governments do not trade with other countries. Firms trade with other firms. Now here's one for you. You talked about the difference in different departments. A prominent trade economist told me a couple of weeks ago that you don't actually know what anything costs in South Africa because of this toxic system of subsidies, for special interests. It's chicken, it's steel, it's whatever. It's ridiculous, and you could then display your sort of the 5 jobs you saved, and ignore the fact that you might have lost 500 because no one is going to touch this market to actually build stuff that we could do competitively if we can get our systems right. So yeah, that's I think there is a great deal of attention that needs to be paid to it, but I'm just not seeing any evidence that we're remotely near that sort of the sort of maturity that would require to take it seriously. And these are deeply serious issues. And I'll say this here. I've said it many times. South Africa has nothing to offer Israel and Palestine. Nothing. We have no experience in territorial claims. We have no experience in nationalisms which have a religious component. Sorry, we're sort of fighting on a mountaintop there. Anyway, that's my view.
Thank you very much, Terence. Anything else in the room for comments or a question, and then we'll move on to online. Yes. Steve, can I maybe take the guest first? No.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. This is very interesting. And I think what I wanted to understand is obviously, I think it provides a really good sort of overview of the various positions. And when you keep referring to pragmatism on a foreign policy level, I interpret that to mean sort of a Kissinger-esque realpolitik approach to how countries interact with others, which is if it can be economically beneficial, we can turn our head the other way when it comes to ideological alignment, right? So from what you've explained, it seems to me like beyond BOSA, EFF, and the MK, everyone else seems to be like, well, our doors are open so long as business is good. First of all, is that a fair conclusion to reach? And second of all, I think if we were to take that approach, that allows us to conclude that, for instance, with the ANC, it's this misalignment with its domestic approach versus its international approach. Maybe makes sense if we're looking at it from a pragmatic perspective. But how does that then impact where BOSA might then look to align with Western democracies, which may be more reflective of our own constitutional democracy? How does that impact if we look at, for instance, MK or the EFF seeking close alignment with the, I won't say BRICS, because obviously BRICS itself has an interesting combination of democracies and non-democracies. But how would their positions sort of impact, South Africa's own domestic approach, if that's not too abstract as a question?
No, not at all.
Sorry, let's just next this question and then we'll shoot it.
So lots of things go through a voter's mind when she places her mark on the ballot. To what extent do you think?
Only woman thinking.
Yeah, only. The foreign policy in the mix of everything else that people are considering when they're voting. What to what extent? And I like the way Terence put it, that if you are going to vote on the Israel-Palestine issue, you probably have made your decision 20 years ago. What do you think the mix is? Is foreign policy decisions of all the things you outline in the book really that important, or are there domestic issues that are much more important?
Well, I'm going to start with that one first because it's the easiest one to answer. No, international, I mean, certainly with people that I've engaged with on the book, the people that have come to launches, people that have come to talks and that type of thing, they're not very interested in where political parties are from an international affairs perspective, unless they have some sort of emotive connection to what's going on in Palestine, what's going on in the Ukraine, maybe have family in Israel. Unless there's some sort of emotive connection or they are expats, it's low down on the list of things. I mean, the thing that people want to engage with most are safety and security, economic growth and job creation, and energy. I mean, come on. Are we going to have sci-fi levels of load shedding after May 29? Experts think not. If you charge your, I hope you've charged your generator and your batteries. So to answer your question, no, I don't think it's necessarily the point that people are going to pivot on this election. I just don't see it happening. But I do think that it is important. To answer your question, Sanan, it's a difficult one. What I will remind you is that there's 17 parties in that book. I'm not saying that the top 3 matter the most, but they are going to be the most influential. And to a certain level, as we enter an arena of national coalition politics, maybe not this election, maybe next election, smaller parties are going to come to the fore and play a grander role. But to put their international relations standpoints as high up on the list, if you've only got 1% of the vote, and maybe the ANC is offering you a deputy ministry, well, I'm sure that they're not going to be offering you Durka, because Durka remains one of the mainstays of government. Well, I mean, yeah, I really, really hope not. Stranger things have happened. But I mean, to answer your question, it's easy for a party to trot out lofty ideas about foreign policy, about energy, about any of the things that have happened in this book, because they're safe in the knowledge that they're not actually going to have to implement it after May the 29th. And I think that that's why you get this constant referral back to pragmatism. Let's be honest as well, real politics does dictate foreign policy to a large extent. You mentioned it, the gentleman from the race relations. South Africa, yes, we did negotiate our way.
Look at gentlemen.
South Africa did negotiate its way out of civil war, but were the international relations not placed where they were in 1989 and 1990, things could have looked a lot differently. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. De Klerk unbanned the ANC and released Mandela 3 months later. You're blind if you don't see those two things connected. If the Soviet Union didn't fall, apartheid South Africa could have continued even with its reforms, providing some sort of fig leaf for American interests. I'm not too sure it could have, but I mean, to come back to the question that you asked, I don't think that political parties are, especially the minutes, are that concerned in terms of what they're putting forward from a international affairs perspective, unless they've got long-standing policies like maybe, for instance, Pan-Africanist Congress, they've always said that they want the United States of Africa, they want to collapse the borders, they want free movement and trade. But like, for instance, another party that says exactly the same thing, Al Jamal, are they even going to make it to the international, are they even going to make it to the Durka committee in Parliament? I don't think so. So once again, I mean, I think it also refers back to the question about whether or not it turns the down the voters' decision. I don't think it does.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. I'll ask Tamsin if you want to come in with some period on the questions I've posed. Tamsin, you can go first.
Yeah, I think they've kind of been. I don't know. Give me 2 seconds. So I definitely agree that foreign policy doesn't necessarily play a factor in how people choose their votes. However, I'm obviously preaching to the wrong choir, but recommending to political parties to have a stronger stance within their foreign policies, because one thing you'll find amongst a lot of our youth is that there's this belief that South Africa is the Switzerland of Africa, and that within all of our foreign engagements, we choose the completely peaceful side, ignoring all nuances. There's no this is right, this is wrong, and don't have a very strong international voice. And this we see when we're hosting our United Nations debates. We give the school South Africa, and regardless of what school we give the position of South Africa, they will never ever take a sort of polarized view on whatever topic that we're speaking on. So sort of engaging with political parties to make a stronger stance on different topics, so that and we're talking about the internal conflicts within government, how a political party is also then looking at that and what that looks like on a foreign policy type of level. And another engagement that young people have with foreign policy with South Africa and Africa is the effects of neoliberalism on our democratic state, and what that actually means for us as South Africa and our position on the African continent.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. Before I come to you to answer this round of questions, can I just add more questions? Because I think some you can speak to. So from online, we have a question that says just shown catalog of political party positions on international relations related issues seems quite useful. Where can we access it? So Nicholas, I think this is time for some good old promotion.
It's a pity you're not in the room, because I have a piece of paper that's got a QR code where you can have the free, easily downloadable access to it. I hope everybody in the room takes a copy of that little slip, maybe not to pop up tables at home, but actually use the QR code and get the guide. You can find that on my social media. I suppose the easiest place, at Nicholas Bauer on X, formerly twitter.com. There's a free download. You can download it as a PDF, or you can engage it for free on the Emerging Scholars Initiative website at the University of Victoria.
Thank you. Isabel, did you have something to?
Yeah, you can scan the QR code now and copy the link in the chat.
So we'll add the link to the chat where you can access the material.
And sorry, so just also mention it's also available as a podcast on Australia Africa, available on Spotify. I'll share the code with the URL with Isabel.
Thank you very much. So all that information will be shared on the chat function. There's a reflection from Laura Jane Watkins that says the ruling party's foreign policy has been described by IR experts as inconsistent at best. This has led to the disjuncture between government's positions on foreign policy and the general public's understanding of the impact of foreign policy. It is difficult not to draw a pattern between the undermining of the IC's jurisdiction under Zuma's administration and the undermining of our domestic rule of law, the former president's refusal, reluctance to submit himself to our national judicial mechanisms, and the onset of the July unrest. Arguably, this has a precedent where South Africa's relationship with international norms has had an impact on the domestic uptake to the rule of law. In the absence of an official national security strategy in South Africa, has there been any indication of party articulating the relationship between the foreign policy agenda and national security strategy? And I'm hoping that you'll be able to come in on that at the start. Lerato Zibe says so many alignments in foreign policy positions on foreign policy, and I guess this comes from the graphic that Nicholas had put up. And she confirms that, to her knowledge, we very much do have a national security strategy. Let's see if there are more questions. More reflections at this point. So I bring the questions that I've just read out back to the floor. If you have any additions, Nicholas, you're more than welcome to chime in. But Gustavo, to you.
Thanks, and thanks for all of these comments. I thought like they really thought-provoking. I wanted to perhaps start with the conversation on the role of mediation in foreign policy. And I think it's part of, I think we need to broaden a little bit our understanding of what mediation processes provide to a country like South Africa, and to a certain degree what it does provide. It provides a niche foreign policy aspect, which is not going to always be utilized in every single situation, but when it does, it tends to be quite effective, because there is an element of mirror foreign policy in South Africa, right? So there's certain things that happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s, in a way that the transition occurred in the 90s, and there's some in the think tank and NGO field, we call it the sort of theories of change, or what do we assume can be done to resolve international conflicts, and mediation is one of those. Negotiation and dialogue are seen as important vehicles for that. That in a way provided South Africa a lot of entry points for pretty important peace processes in the last 30 years, because we're not just looking into what happened in the late 80s, early 90s. We're looking into what happened in Burundi, in the DRC, Madagascar, in Lesotho, in Ethiopia, with Ethiopia and Egypt, with South Sudan, with Sudan. So we can look into a lot of those aspects, which does not necessarily mean that it's always that is the only solution. But when it's possible, it tends to be a pretty important one. And I think this is perhaps where it gives South Africa often a safe space. And I think it gives South Africa a pretty safe space when there is issues that are particularly more complicated and we don't necessarily want to be heavily involved. There are some interesting cases in there, because I think the Israel-Palestine case is not so much, I think for me it has much more domestic implications than foreign policy implications. And I don't think South Africa seriously considered that will be one of the movers and shakers, but it's by far the most consistent foreign policy issue outside of Africa that South Africa has had in the last 30 years. So it would have been perhaps a bit more surprising if South Africa had taken a different position to what it took, and I'm not positioning whether it did it right, whether it can do or not do. But I think from a pure aspect of predictability, we all kind of expected that South Africa would take that position, and in a way it did. I'm far more in favor of things that we can expect and predict than things that becomes completely from the left field. Issues like Ukraine is a different one, but where South Africa surprisingly is in a unique position at the moment. And I say that with kind of a hint of irony, because I think it's quite interesting the changes that happened in the last year. Part of the challenges South Africa had was particularly because, unlike the Palestinian issue, which still sees a fairly good degree of unity within the political party and within the population at large, we didn't see that on the Ukrainian issue. There was a far more split views within the party, within the Department of International Relations, meaning that that lack of position, like it's not even that the position was confusing, it was too many positions and none of them became the dominant one. Once South Africa decided to have a slightly more clear focus on what it was doing, it positioned itself in a fairly unique space of bridging dialogue between Ukraine and Russia. Not because we're intrinsically special, but particularly because we are one of the few countries talking to both sides at the moment. Our national security advisor is part of the Ukraine Peace Formula, has been part of all of the meetings, is co-chairing a working group with the United Kingdom. And there's certain issues that South Africa is starting to bring more and more, and particularly the issue of abducted children and the issue of prisoners of war, that it wouldn't be particularly unlikely at this stage that a country like South Africa could actually be the one bringing the two parties together. Once again, not because we're special, there's something unique about how we engage with mediation, but it's all about international positioning in that sense. which makes South Africa engage much better with its own Western partners at the moment when it comes to issue Ukraine. I meet with a lot of the Western embassies on a regular basis. We had delegations from Europe, researchers and policymakers coming here to South Africa, and we're seeing this kind of shift that perhaps took there was a reaction faster from our external partners than from our public opinion. But I think to a certain degree, it's something that is part of our foreign policy, that will remain part of our foreign policy, and I think irrespective of it, it's something pretty powerful. And this is why, when it works, this is why it keeps being repeated on that. Very briefly, I think you mentioned an important point that states do not trade, but states do trade promotion, states do trade policies, states interact with that. And this is why embassies from all over the world have not only their diplomats in their embassies, but also have the trade attaches, those that are going to be negotiating and discussing and providing some of those opportunities. This is where I think South Africa is often fairly weak with that. We have a very poor distribution when it comes to trade attaches from DTI. And I think that is a particular role that he needs to play a stronger view. And I think looking into the different opportunities, whether it is about BRICS is not a trade bloc, but BRICS is increasingly looking into trade infrastructure. What is the capabilities of its own members of interacting with one another? How much can that be not only beneficial for South Africa, but links into other trade priorities that the private sector alone can do? The implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area is intrinsically something that is done by governments, and then it's spread to the different private sector entities that are able to identify some of these new mechanisms. But it's something that talks once again about how disjointed at times policies from the Department of International Relations and policies from DTI often are. DTI just launched the new industrial policy this week, and often you find similarities with how the Department of International Relations does, but very little talks about that own implementation of the ability of the government to do. Final point, I think, when it comes to the issue of national security, I think it is something. I don't think we're short in terms of policies and views of the world. I think sometimes the problem is how disjointed those are with the implementation on the ground. So there was a national interest policy that the Department of International Relations presented around 2 years ago. But it was a very lengthy process of 7 to 8 years. So by the time that it had been presented, it was already a bit outdated, not necessarily because it was a bad document, but it's things are changing and changing very fast. So I think it's part of the thing is to democratize dialogue and to democratize debate around foreign policy that comes from the Department of International Relations, that comes from Parliament, that comes from the different political parties. Also, an acknowledgement there is a limitations of how far political parties, including one like the ANC, can do in terms of implementation of everything that is related to foreign policy. ANC, and I'm using the ANC as an example because they've been a ruling party for 10 years. They've been particularly active on certain files, but not active on every single file. So if the South Africa is in the UN Security Council discussing issues related to the DRC, a very important country for us, usually these are decisions that are made by the Department of International Relations. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that some aspects of international relations are emotional, ideological, and these often have a lot of debates. Some aspects are very bureaucratic. If you were to look at how bureaucratic discussions in the Security Council are, this is something that diplomats do because it's dull, boring, lengthy, and it's about bureaucracies. And those aspects are important in our foreign policy too, and it's important for us to kind of split a little bit of how much political parties can influence every single aspect of the way that our foreign policy starts and
Thank you, Gustavo. We are now a little bit over time, so I'd like to just, did you have anything to add, Nicholas? 'Cause-
No, not at all. I think very well covered.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much to the session speakers. We had Nicholas with a very illuminating presentation. We had our discussants, Tamsin Smith, Simpiwe Masilo, and Gustavo Dukavala. And with that, thank you very much, Connie. I will now hand over to Steve, who will facilitate the next session. Thanks.
Isabel, should we maybe move down to that side of the table so we can be, what's that on this? Yeah.
Sure.
Question maybe tap.
Okay.
No, I said your question. Very good. Made me tap. Ask some questions.
Okay. Well, welcome to the last session of today's discussion. I think someone's moving that because the cameras. So we've moved a little bit towards the this end of the table to hopefully get you to see us and hear us a little bit more. So I'm very delighted to welcome here Sanam Mirzoyev, who's one of the co-authors, along with Judith February, of SAI's latest report, a special report on the Zondo Commission. And it's entitled, we're launching today, and you can get on, it should be on our website already, and there's also a QR code. But here's the report, and it's entitled Commissions, Corruption and State Capture, Charting the Way Forward for South Africa. And I think it's a good encapsulation of what we were trying to do. There've been a lot of reporting, a lot of books about the Zondo Commission, but not really looking at commissions of inquiry and what they are and how they work. I mean, I heard a statistic, I don't know how true it is, but that President Ramaphosa has appointed over 150 commissions of inquiry, special working groups, special task forces, etc. And sometimes one gets cynical about commissions in that it's a way to quiet the noise and to actually not do anything but create a commission. So we looked at a number of different, or Sanam and Judith looked at a number of different sorts of commissions in this study, but it was also really trying to hone in on what the recommendations of the Zondo Commission were, and where we are now. It's probably a year and a half since the commission closed, and Sanam would have the stats, but it took a long time. It cost a lot of money, and it's the full report is pages and pages, thousands of pages. Where has it brought us now? Have we seen changes? Is state capture a thing of the past, or it's something that we're still going to take generations to outlive and to outrun? And how many people are sitting in jail because of what they did? So, has there been a connection between the report and actually holding people accountable for, stealing billions? But just to introduce Sanam in brief, he is a practicing advocate, and he has focused on public and constitutional law and human rights. He served as a law clerk to various justices at the Constitutional Court in 2016. He was awarded a Chevening Scholarship to pursue his LLM at the University of Cambridge, and has worked with the National Prosecuting Authority and in the anti-corruption sphere. So Sanam, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Steve. And I think your introduction was quite comprehensive. I hope I still have something interesting to say about this. But it's this has been the product of quite a lot of work, and we're quite proud to finally see it in physical form. I was looking at it now for the first time, and I see it actually looks quite short. I think maybe we should print it A5 so it actually does justice to how much effort it feels like we're into this. So Judith and I started working on this back in July 2022. So it has been quite a long time coming. And I think, we obviously set out to do this pretty ambitious thing. And I use ambition or ambitious as a euphemism for many different words, which I may not think are appropriate for this forum. But, at the time, obviously, a lot of work had gone into the nuts and bolts of, various commissions. The media was doing a cracking job of sort of unpacking what were the things that were happening. And of course, a lot of academic work has also been done on the State Capture Commission itself to effectively try and understand, what happened there, and really looking at the nuts and bolts of the various mechanisms of how it worked and what went on. And what we thought would be interesting would be to try and take a step back from all of this. Obviously, there's two ways in which information can be hidden. The first is when you act very clandestine and hide it away from the public eye. The second way is when you put so much of it into the public domain that no one actually knows what on earth is going on. So we thought to ourselves, what if we went and we actually looked at this through the lens of commissions? So it was taking an institutional lens to various commissions that had happened in South Africa. First of all, it's all post-democratic commissions, but we looked at sort of the pre-Ramaphosa administration commissions and also the post-Ramaphosa administration commissions. And looking through this institutional lens of commissions, try to understand what was state capture, how did it work, what role did the commission have in terms of addressing it or sort of looking into it. And then from there, looking at the recommendations and seeing what do these various recommendations mean for South Africa and to what extent have they been implemented. And I think Steve obviously alluded to the fact that, how many people are we seeing in orange overalls at the moment? Well, 0 is the answer, but there's obviously been some small arrests and convictions, but obviously the big fish are still very much out in the sea. So the way in which we decided to do this obviously involved reading reams and reams of paper, and it still haunts me to this day. But we got through it, and effectively looking at these reports. One would be faulted for looking at it from a very narrow perspective, right? And as a lawyer, I'm inclined to think about the world through a legal lens, and the answer to all of the world's problems are legal. The economists might say the same thing with regards to the economy, and the foreign policy experts may emphasize the importance of foreign policy, for instance, in the elections. So obviously, we're all guilty of looking at it from the particular perspective that we take in society and the positions that we hold. So we try to do something a little bit different here, which means that it's not exactly an academic production per se, because we looked at a variety of different sources, right? We wanted to understand the narrative of state capture as it was playing out in the media. So that necessarily meant looking at various reports being made in periodicals. We also wanted to understand it from how the judiciary was grappling with it. And we spent quite a lot of time looking at various cases that sort of preceded the State Capture Commission, but also sort of coincided with it. And then we also wanted to look at research that had been taken by various civil societies in terms of how they were trying to come at this from a sort of activist perspective and to try and hold government accountable. And by doing this, we almost tried to pay an homage to what many commentators had agreed. It's a sort of common refrain that the three things that saved South Africa during the period of state capture was the media that was independent and robust, civil society, and the judiciary, right? So we kind of tried to mimic that with compiling this report. And so what we do here is, in fact, we start by looking at the background to the Zondo Commission. One may be forgiven for thinking that the commission, as perhaps a defining feature of Ramaphosa's administration, was his idea. But again, you'll be forgiven for thinking this because of how much information has been put out. But if you go all the way back, you'll see that it was actually the public protector's decision, and it was actually instituted by the former President Zuma. So we try to unpack how that all came to be. And we start by looking at the centrality of the institution of the public protector. And again, people will often see these different issues playing out in the media and think of them in disparate ways, but we try to harmonize it. And when we look at the public protector, we have to start sort of from the base of where the public protector's powers were found by the Constitutional Court to be binding. And that is quite seminal and very important in terms of South Africa's position when it comes to state ombuds, as opposed to any other jurisdiction and its approach to state ombuds, where you find that in other countries, an ombud who looks into the same types of issues of maladministration and misappropriation in government may only be able to make recommendations. And what set South Africa apart from that was because of our constitution, because of Chapter 9 of the Constitution and the way in which the public power of the public protector was entrenched in there. And of course, as a result of the Constitutional Court's decision, it turned the public protector into something more than an ordinary state's ombud. And perhaps that also then underpins why the public protector has been a political hot potato in many respects, because through the Constitutional Court's decision, now you had this entity in the state that can have quite a lot of checking and balancing power against other state institutions. And perhaps this is also, at least in our view, symptomatic of an overcompensation in terms of the trias politica. So we look into that into the report as well. So look, obviously looking at the, it's a idea from antiquity, so it's nothing new. But looking at Montesquieu's sort of approach to how a state should be structured in terms of the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, we obviously see there that during the period of state capture, there was serious institutional failings happening in one of the arms of state, or two of the arms of state at least. And so perhaps South Africa had to undertake what was a judicial overcompensation for the sake of trying to balance out the issues that were transpiring in the other arms of the state. And if you look closely at what Montesquieu had said, that a single failure in any one of the three arms can have devastating effects for the country as a whole. So obviously that left us with the question of, well, what do you do now when you have two of these arms that are in dire straits and require some intervention? And again, so we then go into that and we look at, how did the judiciary attempt to address that? Through the public protector, obviously we go to the point that one of the Thuli Madansella's swan songs before she left her office was to produce this report into state capture. And her recommendation there was quite a radical one. And obviously this was bolstered by the fact that she had acquired these new powers as a result of the Constitutional Court's decision on the Nkandla matter. She now ordered that the president was required to institute a commission looking into state capture. And there's a whole legal dimension to this, which we didn't go into. But obviously the question is, whether a public protector should be able to mandate the sitting president to institute a commission, which is an exclusive presidential power in the Constitution. It then is not so surprising that her successor, Busisiwe Mkhwebane, then proceeded to do some far-reaching recommendations, such as requiring Parliament to amend the Constitution and change the mandate of the Reserve Bank. So, you see it's very much the two sides of the same coin in terms of how radical the exercise of that power was. But now we had the Zondo Commission. And it wasn't that the former president was content with it. In fact, he fought it tooth and nail, and we sort of talked through the cases that had been unsuccessfully taken up at the courts and the ultimate outcome there. And so ultimately we then look at the fact that now we've had this thing that was established, and here you have this commission. But what is a commission actually? What is it meant to do? What purpose is it meant to serve? And so through that, then we go into this wider question of what are commissions? What is state capture? How does corruption play into all of this? And when we look at commissions, we really try to go quite analytical into this, which may lose some of the non-lawyers, but hopefully we buffered it with enough media articles to keep it interesting. But effectively, what we look at there is, you get various types. So there's the type that I just mentioned now, which is one that is instituted by the president. Now, why would you go and institute a commission rather than, pursue a matter through court, for example? So the main reason that we sort of unpack in the report is because if you were to go to a court, you're confined to a very narrow issue that the court has to consider. And one may see, for instance, the DA's recent challenge of the counter deployment policy, which for all intents and purposes was vindicated in the Zondo Commission report, but failed horribly before the High Court, as an example of how you need to limit your issues in court to the facts that you can prove, rather than abstract concepts such as policies that exist on a shelf somewhere. You actually need to have tangible proof in order to succeed in the court. So obviously looking at something as wide and encompassing as state capture would never be an appropriate way, or a court would never be an appropriate forum in which to try and address that particular issue. And so through that, then we talk about these types of commissions beyond the president's type, presidential commissions. You also get statutory commissions, which may be sort of mechanisms built into democracies, which require or which serve as effectively a check and balance. And one of those is, for instance, the commission that's established in terms of the National Prosecuting Authority Act, which Ramaphosa had established early on in his administration to remove two of the senior leaders within the National Prosecuting Authority. That wasn't done because of the president's volition to try and explore an issue broadly. That was a formal requirement before those two senior individuals could be removed from their offices. So we look at those two different types. Again, we tried our best to avoid going into the nuts and bolts of what actually transpired inside those commissions. You know, we offer quite a cursory approach to it because I fear that, at least in our view, by going into detail into all of those, you may have lost that sort of broader narrative of what was transpiring across these different, components and these different limbs, I suppose you could call it, of state capture. And obviously then going to that, the Zondo Commission then offered the perfect opportunity in which to try and create a really broadly based approach to trying and unpacking what was going on across various state institutions in South Africa and how had this process unfolded. But at the same time, we also had several other commissions. And while Ramaphosa could not claim agency for the State Capture Commission, because obviously, as I had said before, this was a product of Thuli Madonsela's work, he could take credit for the Nugent Commission or the Mpati Commission, the Nugent Commission which looked into SARS and the Mpati Commission which looked into the PIC, or the Mokgoro Inquiry, which obviously looked into the NPA. Those were all instituted on his own behalf. And so, you know, when we look at those various types of commissions, what we really see and how we then segue that into a discussion of state capture is how do you distinguish corruption, which, you know, everyone sort of accepts as endemic and everyone has some sort of expertise in corruption to some extent because of how much interest it's effectively captured the public imagination over the past however many years. But how do you then differentiate between ordinary corruption, grand corruption, and state capture? You know, how do you look at that at the various different levels? And we try to offer a working definition using effectively what Justice Zondo had said himself had included in his report, but also looking at sort of the wider issues in terms of, you know, how has this played out in terms of these various commissions that we've looked at. And one of the points that we conclude on there is that what differentiates state capture from, for instance, your typical grand corruption, where, just to offer a quick working definition, grand corruption is effectively where the political elites use their position and their stations in society in order to try and entrench not just themselves, but also those that are affiliated with them and try to enrich themselves, right? But what takes state capture rather a step further than that is the fact that there is a systematic dismantling of institutions. And that is something that is a unique feature when you talk about a democratic state, right? A form of grand corruption can play out in all sorts of types of countries, right, which have all different types of systems. But when you talk about state capture specifically, you almost require the existence of functioning democratic institutions before you then have actors that then try to deliberately dismantle or otherwise control those institutions. And then we look at what were the features of it, all right? So in order to look at the features, we needed to look at the policy approaches that had been followed by Zuma early on into his administration. So some of this, and one of his first acts was, for instance, to centralize, because centralization was a key way in which to exert control. Decentralization is an enema to projects to try and assert power or dominance, right? So centralization was a key feature of that. We also look into the former president's sort of background in intelligence apparatus, both within and outside the state. And we sort of tongue-in-cheek, we call it Maslow's hammer. You know, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And so with a strong background in intelligence, it seemed like everything became a product of espionage or subject to a project of espionage, right? And so what was quite interesting is when we started looking at all of these things together, one of the first things that the former president did was he consolidated the intelligence apparatus in South Africa. He took the domestic agency and the foreign agency and consolidated it into a single agency, into the SSA. The SSA, which then reported to a director general, which then in turn reported to a minister, a newly established minister, who then reported directly to the president. So all of that had that centralizing effect. And then we look at issues like procurement. When you look at procurement as a particular aspect, we see that through the State Capture Commission and through these various discussions that state-owned entities were the primary vehicle through which a lot of the sort of funds were taken out of the state, right? And the way in which, the reason for that, we argue at least, there was a very important reason for that. Because as opposed to a government department, which has many different levels and treasuries and various approvals, a state-owned entity effectively acts like a quasi corporate entity in the sense that it has a board and it has a treasury internally and it has all of these different controls, which allows it to effectively act as a company, which effectively means that if you're going to go and have large-scale projects, which is also something that state-owned entities regularly engage in, it's quite easy to have a centralized approach in terms of how business is done when you look at an SOE. So it's no wonder then that when we look at how funds were extracted out of the state, the vast majority of it went out of Transnet and Eskom, which is why in the report we exclusively focus on those two, and we maybe go a little bit into the nuts and bolts there in terms of unpacking the details, which again I won't bore you with now. There'll be plenty of time to look at it in the report, but we effectively look into that and we explain how that particular function operated. And we hope that when you're looking at this, you can also see how the interplay between the recommendations that are ultimately made by Justice or Chief Justice Zondo and effectively the manner in which these projects unfolded at Transnet and at Eskom, you can see the overlap, how, for instance, procurement policy in South Africa contributed to the particular outcome, or how cadre deployment may have played a role, or how centralization may have played a role. So the idea is that the recommendations in a way speak to the particular issues which we try to unearth to varying degrees of success, or at least you'll be able to judge for yourself when you see it. But we try to draw a link between those. So beyond that, we also look briefly into pre-run proposal commissions. And the reason for this is quite simple. So if we're looking at commissions through the institutional lens, then you need to try and understand what the utility of commissions are, right? So many democratic countries around the world have commissions as a sort of feature of their democracies. And Steve already alluded to the fact that it's commonly seen, perhaps on the more cynical side, as a device, a political device, which can be used to deflect public attention for enough time until public interest wanes. One thing we know about public interest is that it is forever shifting. So you put this in everyone's minds for now, and then tomorrow it's the rugby that's interesting and everyone's attention shifts to that. So it allows, almost as a political device, to put something out there, make the public or assuage the public that something is being done about this particular issue until such time that the public is no longer concerned or has perhaps accepted it as the status quo. Some have a more optimistic view of commissions, right? Some look at it as being an integral part of public accountability. I'd already mentioned earlier that a commission allows you to look into an issue far more broadly than a court would, for instance. So there is a certain practical utility in a democratic state for unpacking information around major public events that happen. And, the Marikana Commission of Inquiry is one example of, sort of a public event which shocked the public psyche, which then resulted in this sort of unpacking of what had happened. And of course, South Africa is no stranger to commissions. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had, in fact, ushered in our democracy. So, that was a key feature of South Africa's sort of nascent stages. And so we've always had this interesting relationship with commissions where it sort of almost allows the public to grapple with a certain widespread trauma, while at the same time unearthing issues in a broad enough way that allows these sort of concerns to be unpacked. Right, so others also contribute to the sort of optimistic perspective by saying that it's an important feature of democracy, because the fact that commissions are by their very nature public allows public participation as well, means that it has a effective utility in the state, right? So I try to unpack that, or at least when I was looking at it and trying to figure out how we best present it, we needed to consider, the different perspectives, the more pessimistic and the more optimistic. But ultimately, the results are the ones that speak for the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of a particular intervention or approach. And when we look at, for instance, the Marikana Commission, we find that there were widespread reforms recommended. A number of officers and individuals who were implicated were referred to investigations, but yet to this day, there's not been a single prosecution. And this is nearly 2 decades later. So one is left to conclude, and we leave that to you, to conclude whether that was just a political device whether it was a public utility or sort of transparency enhancing feature of our democracy, or at least in my view, is that things don't need to exist in dichotomies. Things can exist on a spectrum. Perhaps there were a little bit of both. We also then look at the Sariti Commission, and that's effectively the arms deal that had unfolded. One of the sort of early controversies, and some even suggest that sort of the early stages of fracture within the ruling party. And what we conclude on there is obviously we look at the court decisions that have followed. The commission itself had obviously concluded that nothing was untoward, but then in courts on review, then it was found that some key evidence was excluded, and effectively the commission itself had been overturned. That litigation was driven by Corruption Watch, sort of notorious and well-known NGO, which was very much harming the government at the time of state capture. And effectively, the question that remained then is, okay, well, this is fantastic. A commission that was sort of received widespread negativity and criticism could be overturned in court. But for parity of principle, now you've also opened the door to the fact that other commissions may also be then challenged. And should they be challenged? These are sort of some of the rhetorical questions that we try to grapple with in the report itself. So going through all of that, I'm just going to keep tabs on the time there, Steve. Do we spend a bit of time? Okay. So we then go to, sort of unpacking all these various dimensions. And again, as I say, it was ambitious, and we'll let anyone who chooses to read it decide how successful we were in our mission. But ultimately, where we come to is looking at the recommendations that were made by the Zondo Commission. And one needs to look at these with, and it's one of Judith's favorite terms, a sense of cautious optimism. And the reason why we talk about cautious optimism is because while the commission may have produced troves of information, in fact, almost too much information, one may argue, the question now remains is, how does accountability come into play? And of course, it is a mistake to conclude that somehow the commission should have an accountability element built into it, because apart from the fact that if you refuse to respond to a subpoena, you may go to jail. There is no other, and we know that obviously from how everything unfolded with the former president's debacle, how that may go. The commission itself doesn't have any sanction power, right? It just produces this report, which is ultimately there for the executive, which also goes to another point of utility, which is it creates a formal position for the government. The government can look at a report and through that then craft policies, right? The media obviously did a really good job of trying to paint the narrative and how it was all unfolding. And obviously they also looked into the fact that, around the time of state capture, Farala Hapaji was, in her book, sort of famously said that, the investigative journalists were completely ill-equipped for the type of work they had to do at the time that they had to do it, and what the public expectation was on them in terms of their capability to do it, which is why it required such a massive consortium to come together in order to try and sort of first look at the leaks that were coming out in the States. And what the commission allows one to do is to actually put resources into that project and to create a sort of formal position for government. So the benefit of it is obviously that on the back of the Zondo Commission, we can say that, yes, state capture did happen in South Africa, and the government can officially say, without taking a particular media slant, that it can accept that this is something that has transpired and can formulate its policies and approaches to how the state is then governed based on that. And that's sort of where we go into the question of looking at recommendations. And what we try and unpack, and we try to group them in sort of broad categories, looking at whether it's criminal sanctions, whether the laws need to be bolstered in South Africa. And one may argue that the challenge in South Africa has never been the robustness of our legal framework. It's always been the effectiveness of our implementation of that framework. And so one may say that that is, sort of a hollow song, in the sense that perhaps more criminal law is not what is required here, but rather an effective application of the existing legislation is what is needed. There's a point around procurement reforms. And again, the cautious optimism here is the fact that there's been the procurement bill, which has been doing its rounds. And one may think that it just started doing its rounds recently, but actually this thing has been doing its rounds for many, many years. In fact, we first saw the new procurement bill during the previous president's administration, and it's made numerous disappearances, although I've recently read that it's now seemingly on the last stage of its implementation, and we'll see what comes from that. But in looking at procurement, we look at how these reforms need to be addressed. And obviously, one of the things that the Chief Justice pointed out in his recommendation is that procurement itself needed robust reform, and there needed to be greater accountability built into it. One also is then left to look at the current policies and how these are being approached. When you look at, for instance, the examples from Transnet, a lot of these deals were brokered through the prism of BEE and sort of the need to bring in development partners when sort of your big players like your McKinseys of society were taking on these massive projects. And so, you know, the question is whether the application of that policy, which, you know, we see looks very much the same as Afrikaner nationalist policy during the height of apartheid, whether that is still fit for purpose. And to say, you know, whether new imagination is required in terms of a means and needs test rather than, you know, sort of one that goes on to sort of simplified classification. We look at law enforcement, which is again a central recommendation, particularly capacitating law enforcement agencies after they have been hollowed out through the period of state capture, and the sort of burning question of the need to create a new single anti-corruption agency. Now, Hoffman, who's sort of quite a prolific commentator in the anti-corruption space, has sort of pointed to the fact that we need a new anti-corruption agency. And you know, our view is perhaps a bit more critical than that, in the sense that, you know, everything that is new and shiny isn't always gold. What we problematize here is the idea behind creating an agency is great and all, but if one looks at the sort of pragmatic aspect of fighting corruption, there are so many different legs involved in terms of what you need in order to successfully prosecute a case. To capacitate a state entity to that level would require the kind of resource that South Africa doesn't have. In fact, it would be hard to find any country that has the kind of resource that may be required, which is why some of the sort of more advanced economies in the world have taken an approach of coordination rather than creation of sort of focused agencies. And the reason for coordination makes a lot of sense, because you look at what you would need in South Africa. You would need to go to the Financial Intelligence Center to get transactional reports. You would need to go to investigative services, which often forms part of the police, in order to get that sort of initial investigation going. You would need sort of prosecutorial power in the form of lawyers and people who can devise strategies in terms of how you're going to pursue this in court. And because of all these different elements that would be involved, there may be an element of tax evasion, where you would need to get the revenue service involved. Now, try to create a single agency which has all of these elements to it and try to conceive on a practical basis what it would entail to do this successfully. We would suggest that that's not how it should be done. Rather, a coordinated approach is one that would effectively borrow from all of these different institutions and create a sort of central center. And it's something that we saw in South Africa in the creation of the Fusion Center during sort of the COVID-19 pandemic, where these different agencies were brought together to try and collectively tackle certain problems. Cool. You know, one of the points that we take certainly positively was around whistleblower protection. And so there's been a much stronger gusto around creating realistic reforms around whistleblower protection. And it is something that South Africa has lagged behind, but it doesn't lag behind the rest of the world. But our policy perhaps mimics the Western approach to whistleblower protection too much, to the extent that we don't take into account the practical realities of South Africa and sort of the context from which we operate. And so some of the approaches there that have been followed has always been to protect employment. But we suggest that protection of employment is just one small feature when there's real violence and threats to lives. And so sort of there have been a lot of positive sort of steps being taken in terms of trying to cater for the reality of South Africa, where you have the Peter Deokarans being assassinated in their driveways. And how do you actually factor that into your legal system so that whistleblowers are given real protection? Again, the centrality of it cannot be understated. Without whistleblowers, none of this would have been uncovered. So the fact is that it remains, regardless of all the state of art and all the new innovations that are coming out in the state from a bureaucratic perspective, it remains the most effective tool that we have in combating corruption is the people that are willing to take a principled approach. There's a few other points that we talk about around intelligence, which I've already alluded to earlier, also around cadre deployment. I won't go into that now because I see we have just hit time. But yeah, I hope we've done the idea justice, and that ideally what we try to achieve with this report is that people have a cursory way to look at all of these things that have happened and to construct a single narrative around what does this all mean. And we felt that it was necessary to do all of this work for the sake of creating something that's short-ish, 89 pages short. I know by science standards that's not very short, but something that's relatively short and something that is relatively digestible and allows one to sort of grapple with all of these features that we've seen. Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now you know why Sanlam gets paid to talk, because he really did a fantastic job of summarizing a complex report. I mean, I think the temptation in the research was how deep down the rabbit hole on each of these do you go? And I think in the end, the report does a really good job of, as you say, making it a story. And one of the phrases that kept coming up during the state capture period, I remember Praveen Gordon's would often say, connect the dots. And it's actually very difficult to find causality and to, attribute what influences what. But again, I think the report will make a big contribution to South Africans' understanding of the state capture phenomenon. And well done to you and Judith for putting in this work. So firstly, are there any questions in the room? Terence?
Yes. Okay. No, I'm very much looking forward to reading this, and Steve knows that I'm the one guy who does read things. I'm probably the only person who's read all of the APRM standards on the whole continent. Okay, so this is super. If I may, I've got two big comments. First of all, you said it's often said, and you're quite correct, that the three things that save South Africa: the courts, media, and civil society. I'm going to say the parliamentary opposition. I know that for many commentators that's radioactive, and you're not supposed to give them credit. But let's remember that it was the DA that took Menzies Mlwane to court. It was a DA that fought against the full war chest of the South African state and Zuma for the spy tapes. And let's also remember that in 2009. It was the DA that put up those posters saying "Stop Zuma," which were just so dreadful that they clearly had consigned the DA to the electoral dustbin. Yeah, 10 years later, some of the same journalists who are saying that now birthed in the United States. How could it have come to this? Well, sorry, you were warned. The other thing. When we talk about this whole period, there are three things that get South Africans that became big totems for South Africa. It was state capture, as you covered. There was the Marikana massacre, and there was Nkandla. Now, I'm gonna go back a bit. We had the state capture project started in 1997 under Nelson Mandela with cadre deployment. Don't take my word for it. Go and look at their own documents. Nelson Mandela himself said, you are not, to the cadres that we're now deploying, in order to extend power over all levers of power in society, you are not ANC activists only after hours. That, from that we ended up having things like Jackie Celeb. That was an Mbeki project. So, basically what, in that sense, Zuma just crested the wave. The wave was there. That, I think, is not about the pathologies of one administration. It comes down to another very dark part of our political culture that we're often loath to talk about. The second thing, in Nkandla, do you remember the furore made about the questions asked about Mbeki's household? The cost of constructing that, which by any estimate was more than he could possibly have earned over his entire period as president. And I remember, I think it was Business Day had an editorial saying this was the lowest form of politics they could ever indulge in. Well, okay, no, but suddenly it was okay under Zuma. But the point is precedent. The other thing is we remember the Marikana massacre. Does anyone remember the security guard strike in about 2006? I think over 100 people were killed there by strikers, not a single prosecution. And I remember the way leading trade unionists, who would later be described as transformative constitutionalists and whatever, were carrying on in terminology that was not, to my mind, that dissimilar from Rwandan genocide days about, you know, scab labor and whatever. In other words, what I'm saying is that there has been a long trail of tolerating this sort of thing. And I don't know, then we sort of ended up in a situation where, you know, things are, you know, we're being robbed blind, and, you know, we're seeing it done with a level of crudity that was maybe new, but the actual behavior was not. And the behavior had often been overlooked by people who should have known better. I would just like, you know, I'd just like to say on this, and I'm very interested to what you say about cadre deployment, because the Zondo Commission was unambiguous about this, illegal and counter-constitutional. Let's remember that President Ramaphosa, Mr. New Dawn, Mr. Reformist Administration, went before the Commission, defended it, and then said after the fact, well, they're not going to be implementing any of that. No, this is great. This is what everyone does. Sorry, no, I don't care if everyone's doing it, but, you know, when the Chief Justice says this, you know, you want to take it seriously. But they've said, no, we're going to carry on. This is uncontroversial. It's going to do it better. Like, we haven't heard that, you know, dozens and dozens of times. But basically, that's where you start to talk. That is dealt with. The idea that a political party has the right to capture the state apparatus and considers itself a sort of embodiment of society. This will continue happening again and again and again. And also, I'd like to make one other point. Also, it's the DA that's gone after their records. Ramaphosa said before the commission, oh, they don't have any of these. I'm going to say I find it very, very hard to believe that a commission that contained all these higher ups and had its administration could suddenly lose all of these documents just for that period, where President Ramaphosa was in charge of this committee, and which was the period in which we got state capture, you know, at its fullest. It's a point, I think, that, you know, what I said earlier about South Africans want a Messiah. We wanted a Messiah in Ramaphosa. There was nothing that Ramaphosa brought in, you know, when he came in, having been Zuma's deputy, having been the head of the cadre deployment committee, that suggested that he was a reformer, or that there was any change coming. You know, said earlier, we need to sort of save ourselves because, you know, the country is not, you know, there's no Messiah coming. Well, yeah, also be careful of false messiahs.
Passionate points there, Terence. Thank you. Anybody else have a comment in the room? I don't see any online, so I don't know if you've got a reaction to what Terence has said.
Thanks for that. So interesting points, and you know, I think we may have differing viewpoints, but I think it's always good to sort of have discussion around it and sort of see how we land. You know, in terms of opposition parties, you know, obviously we know the DA had sort of played quite a leading role in bringing a lot of the matters to court. And the EFF and the DA were the ones that sort of brought the kind of decision to bear, which effectively, you know, put the public protector in the position that she was and set all of this in motion. So I think we certainly agree there. I would say that in any functional democracy, an opposition party's role is to take on the ruling party. You know, if we were to say that it was a unique feature in our democracy, I would say it was perhaps part of the course, in that you would expect them to do that. Yes, no, but it was that, and that's an important thing to note. And I think, you know, perhaps why the credit is, perhaps, I don't know whether correctly or incorrectly, is given purely to the judiciary, is the fact that the judiciary, as an actual arm of the state, was in the position to decide whether or not it was going to take one approach or not. And the fact that it could sort of stay in line with the rule of law and effectively, you know, uphold constitutional values at a time where, you know, everything was being tested, I think is perhaps a testament to how well that particular arm of state functioned during that period. I would say that, you know, perhaps in even the most difficult or despotic of states, where there are murmurings of opposition, you know, that noise is heard. What the outcome is for those opposing voices, you know, obviously that differs. And we were fortunate enough to have an institutional environment which enabled something to happen. When it comes to cadre deployment, you know, I note your points around that, and you know, I think there's some really valid notions that align with what have been said in the State Capture Commission's reports itself by the Chief Justice. I found it particularly interesting when looking into this research and happening across some of the work by Burnett, who suggests that Kader deployment, whilst perhaps in its formulation is unique and in South Africa's context, it's not anything new in the political establishment of any democracy in the world. Whether you look at, the US and their approach to republicanism versus Democrats and how they then approach appointment of people within state institutions, it's highly politicized. And I mean, the judiciary is perhaps a great example of how politicized it can be, particularly in Supreme Court appointments in the US. What Burnett suggests is that we need to have a certain level of tolerance that the ruling party, whoever it may be, whether it's the ANC today or another party tomorrow, there will be a certain degree of tolerance required where there is this desire to align, state functionaries or public servants within the state with a particular party. We know that obviously the Constitution itself says that you're not allowed to favor anyone based on their political alignments. And so that is perhaps where the tension arises, and where the DA perhaps went wrong in its pursuit of its case in the High Court is that it just rooted it in the fact that the policy exists, and we say the Constitution says that this is not allowed, but did not have any factual foundation in which to say, look at this guy was a Kader, this record says this is what happened, and the sole reason that this person was appointed over and above this person was because of this particular policy that the ANC had internally adopted. The DA's failure to do that ultimately landed them with egg on their face. And so, there's different ways in which to look at it. I do agree with you. I think a formal approach to it can, especially when it reaches sort of untenable levels, which is a danger when you have a single party that stays, in the seat for an extended period of time. There's a danger that sort of slow transformation, comes to the point where it becomes consuming. Whether we've reached that, I think I haven't looked into it enough to reach that conclusion myself. But I can for sure say that, Kader deployment itself was quite a central feature to this. Burnett suggests that there will be some degree of it in any kind of state. And in South Africa, and again, the report looks into this, you have to look at the unique history of South Africa to understand why it was such a central tenet to the ANC's coming to power. They had effectively established or inherited a sort of apartheid era civil service. Where the concern, if in the early documents, again, which we look at in the report, was that there a lot of the individuals that were occupying these offices were in the machine room of the apartheid engine. And so they needed some sort of radical change to take place within the civil service in order to feel like there was some kind of balance. Now, whether it is still whether the balance was sought or whether an imbalance was sought, I think that's where the debate really lies. But the fact that something like that has occurred, I think there may be sort of different perspectives to take onto how effective that has been.
Okay, thank you. We've got a comment here from Tristan. Are the findings of the Commission of Inquiry considered findings of fact for the purpose of criminal proceedings, or would the NPA need to re-lead evidence in any criminal proceedings they might take forward?
Okay, it's a good question. So the response to that is the Commission approaches or uses the approach of a reasonable suspicion or balance of probability. So in the Zondo Commission or in the State Capture Commission report itself, you will see that the terminology or reference is made to both of those, reasonable suspicion or a balance of probabilities. In order to go to court and convict someone criminally, you need to prove something beyond reasonable doubt. So effectively, by the use of these different standards, there is a limited utility to what the Commission produces in terms of its findings. And we must obviously draw a distinction between the findings, which are factual findings based on a, as I said, reasonable suspicion or balanced probabilities, and the recommendations, which then is sort of designed to prompt the executive to then take certain policy and legislative reforms into account. When it comes to the factual findings, it is step one. Obviously, different amendments were made to the terms of reference by Ramaphosa to effectively expand the ambit and to allow information that was accumulating in the State Capture Commission to be shared with law enforcement agencies. But that does not by any means suggest that the work of the law enforcement bodies has been done. It hasn't been done. A lot more work is required because you may have a whistleblower or you may have some kind of exposition that this is the arrangement and this is how this particular collusive act took place. But in order to prove something beyond reasonable doubt, you now need to show very clear ownership structures. You need to show financial transactions. The amount of investigative work required there is considerably more than what was presented before the commission, not in all respects, but at least in the broader sense.
Anybody else in the room?
I think mine would just be a comment. Thank you very much for this lovely report. I think it captures a lot of what you mentioned in the beginning, what are constitutions of inquiry, history of the inquiries in South Africa, and my interest is really the comparative elements that you've included towards the end.
Yes.
You rightly mentioned that many countries institute commissions of inquiry into different things, and I'm interested in this because I come from Zambia. I was sharing with colleagues before in the meeting that, as many as the numerous problems that South Africa has, I think in many areas, South Africa is doing fine. Of course, we can talk about independence of the various institutions, and just looking at this report and what you rightly alluded to, the fact that the judiciary was able to come up with, implement some of these things, is a testament to how well you can say it's independent. Where I'm coming from, we have so many constitutions of inquiry, and the recommendations of those reports are still lying on the table somewhere. And that's because your independent institutions are not exactly independent. So I think this is a really great report to begin some, comparisons and do some work.
Thank you. I don't know if you mentioned it. We also looked at a couple of the missions in Kenya around the very grand corruption. So I don't think that's been done before. I mean, maybe just to end off with, because we've got 5 minutes left. Is this, when we look back in 10 or 15 years, will we say this was the beginning of some real change, or was this just a colossal waste of time and money? The Zondo Commission.
That's a good question. I mean, I think the jury is out, because I suppose it will all really depend, and this is going to be a very loyal answer for you, but it will all really depend on what your expectation was from the commission. If your expectation was that we were going to have a Jacobean style French Revolution and public executions in the town square, you're probably going to be disappointed. If your expectation is that at some point there'll be accountability in the form of sort of significant figures, having to go serve sentences for their actions, again, time will only tell, because the litmus test is really going to be how can law enforcement recapacitate itself and how effectively can it pursue these matters, because the ball is really in their court. If we were going to look at it from the fact that we could actually openly discuss this, create a official position for government from which government could then craft reforms and changes, well, we'll have to see what those exact reforms and changes are, rather than updates on this committee is looking at it, or we've established this council, we have the strategy. I think time will be the ultimate test, and maybe this is a plan for another report somewhere down the line. I don't know if you'll manage to convince me to do this again, because it was quite terrifying. But if we do maybe look at it again in a few years, it will really all hinge on that. Is what kind of policy changes what have we seen? The fact that it was made public is one positive step, but we've seen that can be both a positive thing and a negative thing. And ultimately, who was held accountable for all of this? I think that's not the best answer, but it's the best one I can give you.
That's great. I think as there are no more questions coming in from the room or online, just to say a huge thank you to you and Judith for a really, I think, important report. There should be something in the Daily Maverick in the next couple of days. We've hope to get something there, so it'll be a little bit more publicly known. Just to say that it is on the front page of the SIRE website, www.sire.org.za, and you can download it for free. And it makes a good read. I mean, just maybe one final thought. With our elections coming up, I mean, the report and the Zondo Commission really goes into what you mentioned, the hollowing out of institutions. If it was done in Transnet, if it was done in Eskom, if it was done in SAA, how can we be so confident that it wasn't done in the IEC? which is now facing an election where the ruling party is gaining ground but is in real trouble. It was all fine and well having an IEC that saw over elections that everybody knew who was going to win. Do you think the IEC is on the spot now because of what's happened?
Yeah, it's a good question, Steve. One I can confess that I haven't researched, so you're at best getting a off the cuff answer.
Sure.
I would say that you always need to look at the institutional architecture of the state in order to analyze whether something is susceptible to, you could call it capture. You look at the fact that, in South Africa, I like the allusion to messianic approaches, because we do have this tendency in South Africa to craft institutions for the actor rather than for the institution's sake itself. When Mandela was president, we heaped power onto the president to make unilateral decisions, whether it's appointing the head of the prosecuting authority, and obviously when it's President Zuma in power, then suddenly we're creating a stronger public protector to perhaps see how the checks and balances need to play out. I think the key is always looking at institutional design. When you look at the IEC, its particular constitutional architecture, where it's positioned in the constitution, suggests some degree of separation from other functions of the state. And much like the checks and balances that you do, which you'd expect to see with judicial appointments or with the appointment of the public protector, which is quite a public affair. How it ultimately concludes that the political arena is what it is, but the fact is that a lot of these things are out there and in the open. I think I probably don't have enough knowledge in my head on the current workings of the IEC to give you any informed answer on it. But I would say, at least from an institutional basis, from what I know of how it is set out in the Constitution, there is some degree of insulation from external interference.
Time will definitely tell, and I think what's very different for me is the word independent electoral commission. It does have in my mind, a large degree of independence. Whereas you look at many other African countries, the board is always formed by politicians, and there's always fighting about their credibility.
By the president.
Appointed by the president, and always fighting about its credibility. And the best example is probably Kenya, but Zambia is another example.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. We're going to end it there. Thank you very much to those of you who have stayed with us through the day. Thank you to Sanan, to Isabel in her absence for all the organizing. What we were meant to say at the beginning was that this is part of SIA's 90th birthday events, and we really have enjoyed having you with us. I hope that you have enjoyed the sessions today, and we'll close it there. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting you.
Thank you. It was really nice.
This was very good. And I really appreciate it.
I think there's anything I'm saying.
Thank you.